Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I never should have come here alone. That thought repeats in my mind as I fumble with tent poles in the fading light. My fingers, soft from decades of keyboard work, struggle with the unfamiliar equipment. Sweat trickles down my back despite the cooling evening air. The instructions said this was a 10-minute setup. I'm on minute 45. My name is Shannon Morgan, 50 years old, newly unemployed, and completely out of my element in the backcountry of Yellowstone National Park. 2 weeks ago, I had an office, a title, and a regular paycheck. IT management. 22 years at the same company. Then came the restructuring announcement and the awkward exit interview. I snapped the final pole into place and stepped back to examine my handiwork. The tent looks nothing like the display model at the outdoor store in Bozeman, but it might keep the rain off. Maybe. Not bad for a first try, I tell myself, trying to ignore how my voice sounds small against the vastness of the forest surrounding me. The campsite sits in a small clearing about 2 miles from the nearest marked trail. I'd chosen this spot specifically because the ranger at the permit office had mentioned it was seldom used. Perfect for solitude, he'd said, marking it on my map. But you sure you want to go that far out? First-time backpackers usually stick closer to the trailheads. I'd bristled at his skepticism. I've been preparing for months, I lied. In truth, I'd purchased most of my gear in a frantic shopping spree after the layoff, driven by some middle-age crisis to prove I could still do hard things. Now, as shadows lengthen across my campsite, I wonder if I've made a terrible mistake. The forest feels watchful. There's no other word for it. The massive lodgepole pines stand like silent sentinels, and I can't shake the feeling of being observed. I check my watch. 7:43 p.m., still enough light to hang my food bag and set up my sleeping system. I'd opted for a hammock rather than sleeping on the ground. Less chance of unexpected visitors slithering into my sleeping space. At least, that's what the sales associate had promised. By 9:30, I'm settled in my hammock, exhausted from the day's hike and the stress of navigating unfamiliar terrain. Despite my city-soft body, there's satisfaction in having made it this far on my own. The night sounds of the forest wash over me. Wind through pine needles, occasional rustling in underbrush, the distant call of an owl. I drift towards sleep, my muscles slowly unwinding. The laughter wakes me. Children's laughter, high and bright, somewhere in the darkness. I bolt upright, banging my head on the hammock's rainfly. "Hello?" I call out, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "Is someone there?" The laughter fades, replaced by silence so absolute it feels deliberate. I fumble for my headlamp and click it on, sweeping the beam across the campsite. Nothing moves. My watch reads 2:17 a.m. Just a dream, I mutter, but my heart continues to pound. I lie back down, clutching my small canister of bear spray. Eventually my eyes grow heavy again. The whispering comes next. Not words exactly, but a sound like dry leaves sliding over stone. It seems to circle my hammock, never coming from the same direction twice. I squeeze my eyes shut, telling myself it's just the wind. But there is no wind tonight. The air hangs still and heavy. When I finally dare to look again, fog has seeped into the clearing. Not the gauzy mist of early morning, but something thicker, more deliberate. It moves against the natural air currents, forming shapes that almost, but not quite, resemble human figures. I watch, paralyzed, as tendrils of it reach toward my hammock. When one brushes against the nylon fabric, I feel a sudden, sharp drop in temperature. My breath clouds in front of my face. Something wraps around my throat. Cold, strong pressure cutting off my air. I thrash in the hammock, clawing at my neck, but there's nothing tangible to fight, just the crushing sensation and the absolute certainty that something wants me dead. Then, as suddenly as it began, the pressure vanishes. I gasp, sucking in great lungfuls of air, my throat raw and tender. The fog retreats into the trees. By the time dawn breaks, I've convinced myself it was sleep paralysis, a night terror brought on by unfamiliar surroundings and the stress of my recent life changes. But the ring of bruises around my neck tells a different story. I should leave, pack up and hike back to civilization. But stubbornness, the same quality that made me good at my job and terrible at office politics, keeps me here. One more day, I decide. I've paid for the permits, carried the gear. I won't be scared off by bad dreams and strange weather. After a breakfast of instant oatmeal and 2 strong coffee, I study my trail map. There's a series of hot springs about a mile from my campsite, accessible by what the map labels a game trail. I pack a day bag with water, snacks, and first aid supplies. The bear spray goes into an accessible side pocket. The trail is narrow but easy enough to follow, marked by the passing of countless hooves and paws over generations. The morning sun filters through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. For the first time since arriving, I feel my spirits lift. This is why I came. To experience the wild beauty of this place, to remember there's a world beyond conference rooms and performance reviews. I'm so caught up in the scenery that I almost miss the shift in the forest's mood. The birds go silent first, then comes the awareness of a presence moving parallel to my path, just out of sight among the trees. Something large, something silent. I stop, scanning the forest. 100 feet away, a small herd of bison grazes in a meadow. They're massive creatures, deceptively fast and notoriously unpredictable. But it's not the bison that makes my skin crawl. It's what happens next. As one, the herd raises their heads, massive shoulders tensing. They stare into the tree line to my right, and then, with no visible cause, they bolt. 2,000 pounds of muscle and horn, moving with surprising grace as they flee whatever watches from the woods. And I see it, just for an instant. A dark figure, taller than any man I've known, moving with fluid grace between the trees. Not a bear, the posture is all wrong. Not a moose or elk either. Something else, something that walks upright but isn't human. Fog begins to roll in, the same unnatural mist from the night before. It moves against the breeze, advancing like a living thing. I turn to retreat the way I came, but my boot catches on an exposed root. The fall happens in slow motion, my arms windmilling, pack shifting, knee twisting as I hit the ground. Pain explodes through my leg. I try to stand, but my knee buckles, not broken but badly wrenched. I can walk, but not quickly and not without pain. The fog continues to thicken, erasing the world 20 feet beyond me in all directions. And that's when I hear it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming closer. I pull the bear spray from my pack, thumbing off the safety cap. The footsteps stop. The silence stretches, broken only by my ragged breathing. Then it emerges from the fog. 8 feet tall at least, covered in dark, matted fur. A face that's almost human, but stretched wrong, with deep-set eyes that reflect no light. If I had to put a name to it, I'd call it Bigfoot, but not the gentle giant from blurry photos and campfire stories. This creature radiates malice. It reaches for me with hands too large, fingers too long. And I know, with bone-deep certainty, that this is what tried to strangle me in my hammock. This is what the bison fled. I squeeze the trigger on the bear spray. The capsaicin cloud hits the creature full in the face. It recoils with a sound no human or animal should make, a high, piercing wail that seems to come from everywhere at once. I don't wait to see what happens next. I run, hobbling on my injured knee, each step sending shards of pain up my leg. The fog swirls and eddies around me, sometimes so thick I can barely see the trail. Behind me, crashing sounds follow, punctuated by that terrible ethereal wailing. I don't remember most of the journey back to my campsite. Blind panic propels me forward, past conscious thought or strategic planning. When I finally break through to my clearing, I collapse beside my tent, lungs burning, knee throbbing. The fog hasn't followed me here, yet. With shaking hands, I begin to break camp, shoving gear haphazardly into my backpack. The neat organization system I'd planned is abandoned in favor of speed. The hammock comes down in seconds. The tent takes longer, my injured knee protesting each movement. By mid-afternoon, I'm limping back toward the trailhead 2 miles distant. My pack feels twice as heavy as it did yesterday, and my progress is painfully slow. Every shadow makes me flinch. Every sound sends my heart racing. As dusk approaches, I realize I won't make it back before dark. The thought of spending another night in these woods with that thing hunting me sends cold sweat trickling down my spine. That's when I hear the voices, human voices calling back and forth. I change direction, moving toward the sound, not caring that I'm leaving the trail. "Hello?" I shout, my voice cracking. "I need help. Is anyone there?" 3 figures materialize through the trees, a man in the olive-green uniform of a park ranger, and 2 others in civilian hiking clothes. Their faces register surprise, then concern as they take in my disheveled appearance. "Ma'am, are you Shannon Morgan?" the ranger asks. His name tag reads Carter. "We've been looking for you. You missed your check-in call at the station." I stare at him blankly. "Check-in call?" "All solo hikers in this sector are required to call in daily during fire season," he explains. "When you didn't call, we started a search. Are you hurt?" "My knee," I say, suddenly aware of how much pain I'm in now that the adrenaline is fading. "I fell, but that's not... There's something out there, something in the fog." The 3 exchange glances. One of the civilians, a weathered man in his 60s, makes a subtle gesture that might be crossing himself. "Let's get you back to the ranger station," Carter says, taking my pack. "We can talk there." They help me limp back to their vehicle, parked on a service road I hadn't known existed. As we drive, I learn they're not just looking for me. A couple from Oklahoma has been missing for 2 days, last seen hiking in this same area. At the ranger station, a medic examines my knee while I give a statement about my fall. I say nothing about the creature or the fog. Nothing about the whispering or the children's laughter. I've worked in corporate environments long enough to know when my words will be dismissed as hysteria. After the medic leaves, Ranger Carter brings me a cup of coffee and sits across from me. His expression is carefully neutral, but there's something in his eyes, a wariness that wasn't there before. "You mentioned something in the fog," he says quietly. "Mind telling me more about that?" I hesitate, then decide I have nothing to lose. I tell him everything, the laughter, the whispering, the pressure around my throat, the fog that moved with purpose, the dark figure that frightened even the bison. I pull down my collar to show him the bruises circling my neck. As I speak, Carter's expression grows increasingly grim. When I finish, he doesn't speak for a long moment. "You think I'm crazy," I say finally. He shakes his head. "No, ma'am, I don't." He leans forward, lowering his voice. "What you experienced matches reports we've had before. Not many, and not official. We call them the Yellowstone Whispers." "What is it?" I ask. "I don't know, nobody does. Native stories talk about malevolent spirits in certain parts of the park. Early trappers reported similar phenomena. Whatever it is, it's been here longer than any of us." He rubs his face, suddenly looking much older. "In the last decade, we've found 8 bodies in areas where the fog appears, all with broken necks, all ruled as accidents or animal attacks. The couple we're looking for now, they were last seen near your campsite." A chill runs through me. Why isn't this public knowledge? Why aren't there warnings? "Would you have believed it?" he counters. "Besides, it's rare. Thousands of people visit Yellowstone each day without incident. Whatever this thing is, it's selective. It doesn't hunt in crowds. I think about that for a long moment. The bear spray stopped it, temporarily at least. Carter's eyebrows raise. That's new information. Useful, maybe. He stands. You should get some rest. We'll drive you back to your vehicle in the morning. That night, in the safety of the ranger station bunkroom, I lie awake listening to the wind against the windows. I keep expecting to hear children's laughter or that dry, slithering whisper. But there's only the ordinary sounds of the building settling and distant radios as rangers coordinate their ongoing search. The missing couple is found the next day, 7 miles from where they were last seen. Both dead, both with broken necks. The official report calls it a tragic hiking accident. I know better. It's been 2 years since my encounter in Yellowstone. I never returned to IT work. Instead, I used my severance package to buy a small RV and a pair of rescue dogs, big, loyal animals that bark at anything unusual. I still visit national parks, but never alone, and never without extensive research into the area's history and lore. Some nights, I still wake to the phantom sensation of cold pressure around my throat. On foggy mornings, I stay indoors until the sun burns away the mist. I carry bear spray everywhere, even in cities. People who know my story think I'm traumatized, and they're not wrong. But it's not just trauma that drives my caution, it's knowledge. There are things in this world that lurk at the edges of human understanding, things older and more dangerous than we want to admit. I survived my encounter in Yellowstone because of luck, and because whatever hunts in those remote woods wasn't prepared for modern chemical deterrence. Others haven't been so fortunate. Sometimes I consider going public with my story, but who would believe me, and what good would it do, besides earning me a reputation as another middle-aged woman who lost her mind after losing her job? So I keep moving, my dogs at my side, exploring the beauty of wild places while respecting their dangers, both known and unknown. I've learned to listen when the birds go silent, to watch for unnatural movements in mist and shadow, and I never, ever hike alone. Story 2. My hands were shaking as I slammed the front door, my dad's words still ringing in my ears. Another stupid argument about nothing, the usual stuff, my grades, my attitude, my future. At 15, I didn't need anyone telling me what to do, especially not him. It was summer 1975 in Brunswick, Maine, hot and humid, the kind of evening where the air sits heavy on your skin. I stomped across our property, heading for the large field that separated our house from the dense woods beyond. The farm shack at the edge of those woods had become my refuge whenever things at home got too much. "Mike, you get back here right now!" Dad yelled from the porch, but I kept walking, pretending not to hear. The tall grass brushed against my jeans as I crossed the field, the setting sun casting long shadows across the landscape. By the time I reached the old shack, twilight was settling in. The wooden structure wasn't much, just a dilapidated shelter that the previous owners had used for storing farm equipment. Now it was empty, except for some rusted tools and a stack of firewood. I gathered some branches and kindling from around the shack and built a small fire in the clearing outside. The flames helped push back the growing darkness and gave me something to focus on besides my anger. The woods behind the shack sloped down into a ravine, dark and thick with trees. I'd explored it many times before, but never at night. As I sat there poking at the fire with a stick, I heard it. Something heavy moving in the underbrush down in the ravine. Much too heavy to be a deer or even a moose, the sound of branches breaking, not just twigs, but substantial limbs. Probably just a bear, I muttered to myself. Though we didn't get many bear sightings this close to town. I stood up, grabbed a larger stick and called out, "Hey, get out of here!" The movement stopped. Complete silence followed. Then something strange happened. Something came flying out of the darkness and landed with a thud about 10 feet from my fire. I jumped back, nearly tripping over the log I'd been sitting on. It was a branch, nearly as thick as my arm. "What the hell?" I whispered. Another object came sailing through the air, this one a chunk of dead wood that shattered when it hit the ground. My heart rate doubled. Bears don't throw things. I backed away from the fire, trying to get a better look into the ravine. The fire was now working against me, destroying my night vision and making the surrounding darkness even more impenetrable. Whatever was down there moved again, this time more deliberately. I could hear brush being pushed aside, heavy footfalls on the forest floor. I wasn't about to stick around. I grabbed my jacket and scrambled away from the shack, making my way up to a small hill about 50 yards away, where the grass grew tall. I figured I'd wait there until whatever it was moved on. The hill gave me a better vantage point. I could see my campfire still burning by the shed, but nothing moved in the area between the shed and the ravine. Eventually the fire died down to embers, and I must have dozed off in the grass. I woke to violence, the sound of wood being torn apart. Not the genteel snap of branches breaking underfoot, but the forceful rending of living wood. My eyes flew open. The moon had risen, casting a silvery light over the field and forest. I could make out movement near the tree line, something large and dark. I stood up, my legs stiff from lying in the grass. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear and bravado. The tearing sound stopped. Then came a response that froze my blood, a roar that seemed to come from something between a bear and a gorilla, but distinctly neither. It echoed across the field, vibrating in my chest. I'd never heard anything like it before. I didn't move until morning. When the sun rose, I made my way home, avoiding the shed entirely. I must have looked like hell, because even Dad didn't say anything about me storming out. I barely touched my breakfast before heading to my friend Ben's house. Ben was a year older than me and stood nearly 6 feet tall already. He laughed when I told him what happened. "Probably just a black bear, Mike. They can make weird sounds." "Bears don't throw sticks," I insisted. "Then let's go check it out," he said, grabbing his .22 rifle from his closet. His parents were more relaxed about guns than mine. We hiked back across the field to the shack. In daylight it looked harmless, just an old building slowly rotting back into the earth. The remnants of my fire were still there, and scattered around it were the branches and chunks of wood that had been thrown. "See?" I pointed. "Something threw these." Ben nodded, suddenly more serious. "Let's check the ravine." We made our way down the slope into the small ravine. It wasn't deep, maybe 15 feet at its lowest point, but the vegetation was thick. We found where several saplings and branches had been torn, not cut cleanly like with a tool, but violently wrenched away. "Look at this," Ben said, pointing to a broken maple branch. "This is at least 7 feet up. I can barely reach it." He stretched his arm, and his fingertips just brushed the broken area. We spent the afternoon exploring the ravine, but found nothing else except some areas where the undergrowth seemed trampled. "Want to camp out tonight?" Ben asked. "See if it comes back?" I hesitated, but curiosity won out over fear. "Yeah, let's do it." We went back to our houses to grab sleeping bags and supplies. I told my parents I was staying at Ben's, and he told his he was staying at mine, the usual teenage deception. This time we brought better flashlights and Ben's rifle. We set up near the shack, but positioned ourselves with our backs to the building so nothing could approach from behind. We built another fire and waited. The sun set, and darkness crept in from the east. We talked in low voices about school, girls, and our plans for the summer. Anything to keep our minds off what might be lurking in the ravine. It was around 10 p.m. when we heard it again, the sound of movement in the underbrush, heavy, deliberate. "There's your bear," Ben whispered, raising his rifle to his shoulder. "I don't think," I started to say, but was cut off by something landing heavily in the dirt about 15 feet away. Another branch. Ben swung his flashlight toward where the branch had come from, but the beam only illuminated foliage. "What the hell was that?" he hissed. "That's what happened last night," I said, my mouth dry. Then came the roar, the same inhuman sound that had sent me running before. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Ben fired a shot into the air. The report was deafening in the quiet night. "Get out of here!" he shouted into the darkness. We heard crashing sounds, branches breaking, something large moving rapidly away through the forest. "You see, that wasn't normal," I said, my heart hammering in my chest. Ben nodded, his face pale in the firelight. "No bear I've ever heard of." We didn't sleep much that night, taking turns keeping watch. Nothing else approached the shed, and by morning we were exhausted and jumpy. For the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd encountered. I started reading books about wildlife, trying to figure out what could have made those sounds and exhibited that behavior. Nothing seemed to fit. Then I remembered stories I'd heard about the Durham ape, a local legend about some kind of large, hairy creature that had been spotted in Durham, just a few miles away. I'd always dismissed those tales as nonsense, but now I wasn't so sure. One afternoon in late July, I hiked alone into the woods. I'd been doing this regularly, gradually venturing deeper each time. Ben had lost interest after a couple more uneventful night watches, but something kept pulling me back. I was following a small stream that fed into the ravine when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, next to a large pine tree, stood something that couldn't possibly exist in the woods of Maine. It was tall, at least 8 feet, and covered in dark, reddish-brown fur. It stood upright on 2 legs, its massive shoulders hunched slightly. Its face was flat and wide, with a pronounced brow ridge. It was looking directly at me. I froze, unable to move, unable to even breathe. Time seemed to stop as we stared at each other across the distance. It made no aggressive moves, just watched me with dark, intelligent eyes. After what felt like hours, but must have been only seconds, I backed away slowly, then turned and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached my house, bursting through the door and startling my mother in the kitchen. "Mike, what on earth?" "Nothing," I gasped. "Just running. Exercise." I went straight to my room and sat on my bed, trying to process what I'd seen. A Sasquatch, Bigfoot, in Brunswick, Maine. It seemed impossible, yet I couldn't deny what I'd seen with my own eyes. Over the next 2 years, I developed what I can only describe as a relationship with these creatures. Yes, creatures, plural. Through careful observation and gradually increased interaction, I discovered there were at least 3 of them living in the extensive woodland that stretched beyond our property. I began leaving offerings, apples, berries, even sandwiches, at the edge of the ravine. They would disappear overnight. I set up patterns, routines. They seemed to respond to consistency. My most intense encounter happened when I was 17. I had prepared a small clearing about a half-mile into the woods, leaving food there regularly. One evening at dusk, I sat quietly in this clearing, a pile of fruit placed a few yards away from me. I heard it approach before I saw it, the now familiar sound of heavy movement through the undergrowth. Then the largest of the creatures stepped into the clearing. In the fading light, I could see it clearly. It stood fully erect, towering over me, its massive frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. Its fur was matted in places, and its eyes reflected what little light remained. It grunted, then picked up a stick and threw it in my direction, not at me, but near me. I remained seated, making myself as small and non-threatening as possible. I had learned that direct eye contact seemed aggressive to them, so I kept my gaze lowered. The creature approached the pile of fruit and picked up an apple, sniffing it before taking a bite. We sat there in the clearing, no more than 20 feet apart, me barely breathing, it calmly eating. Then everything changed. From the trees to my right, a smaller, younger-looking Sasquatch burst into the clearing, making aggressive noises, a series of short barking grunts. It moved toward me quickly, arms swinging. I stood up, pulling out my hunting knife, not to use it as a weapon, but to display it. I'd come to believe these creatures respected shows of teeth, and the knife was the closest equivalent I had. I yelled back, making myself appear larger. The younger one hesitated, and in that moment I began to back away slowly. That's when I felt it. A hand on my shoulder from behind. Large, heavy, covered in fur. I froze, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I hadn't heard a third creature approach. The hand didn't grip or grab, just rested there, its weight immense. I could feel warm breath on the back of my neck. Slowly, very slowly, I turned my head just enough to see from the corner of my eye. It was another Sasquatch, slightly smaller than the first, but larger than the aggressive young one. From its build and the softer features of its face, I suspected it might be female. We stood like that for what seemed an eternity, me paralyzed with fear but fighting to stay calm, and this creature with its hand on my shoulder. Finally, it removed its hand and stepped back, making a low, rumbling sound. I continued my careful retreat, moving steadily away from all three creatures. I knew that running would trigger a chase response, so I maintained a deliberate pace until I was well clear of the clearing. Only then did I allow myself to move faster, putting distance between us. After that encounter, I kept my distance. I still left offerings occasionally, and sometimes I would spot one of them watching me from the trees, but I never again attempted such close contact. I had satisfied my curiosity. These weren't supernatural beings or monsters. They were animals. Extraordinarily intelligent, secretive animals, but animals nonetheless. When I joined the Navy in 1978, I left Brunswick behind. I told no one about what I'd experienced except Ben, who had moved on and dismissed my continuing interest as obsession. Maybe he was right. Sometimes, during my years at sea, I would stand on deck at night, looking out at the vast darkness of the ocean and think about those creatures in the Maine woods. I wondered if they were still there, if they remembered the human boy who brought them fruit and learned to speak their language of gestures and respect. I've returned to Brunswick a few times over the years, but I've never gone back to those specific woods. Some encounters are meant to happen only once in a lifetime. Some mysteries are better left in the shadows of memory, where they can remain perfect and untouched by the harsh light of adult skepticism. But I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and somewhere in the forests of Humboldt County, they know too. Story 3. I've been cutting timber since I was 17 years old. That's over 40 years of experience with a chainsaw in my hands, 40 years of understanding the woods and what lives in them. I've seen bears, cougars, and all manner of wildlife in the Pacific Northwest. I've worked in rain, snow, and blistering heat. I've survived kickbacks, falling limbs, and trees that didn't drop where they were supposed to. But nothing in those 40 years prepared me for what I encountered near Mount Curry. It was 4 years ago now, but the memory is burned into my mind like a brand. I was working a contract about 30 miles outside the little town of Packwood, cutting old-growth Douglas fir. It was June, and the summer heat was already making the afternoons unbearable, so I'd taken to starting before dawn. My cutting partner Dale and I would arrive when the forest was still draped in darkness, set up our equipment by headlamp, and be ready to cut as soon as there was enough light to work safely. That morning started like any other. My alarm went off at 3:30 a.m., and I was out the door by 4, thermos of coffee in hand. I picked Dale up at his place, and we drove the logging roads in silence, both of us still half asleep. We reached our cut site around 4:45, still dark as pitch under the canopy of those massive trees. "I'll take the eastern section," I told Dale as we unloaded our gear. "You finish up that cluster we started yesterday." He nodded, checking his saw's fuel. "Meet back at the truck for lunch around 11? "Sounds good." We went our separate ways, headlamps bobbing through the underbrush. I reached my section just as the first hint of dawn was lightening the eastern sky. Not enough to see clearly, but enough that I could make out the massive trunks of the Douglas firs surrounding me. The one I needed to work on had already been felled the day before, a monster nearly 6 feet in diameter at the base. I needed to buck it into sections that could be hauled out. I set up my gear, going through the routine I'd done thousands of times before, checked the chain tension, topped off the bar oil, made sure I had enough fuel for a couple hours of cutting. As the forest grew lighter around me, I pulled the starter cord on my steel 661 and felt the familiar rumble as it roared to life. The first cuts went smoothly. I was about 40 minutes into my work when it happened. A cold sensation crawled up my spine. Not the physical cold of winter, but the primal chill of being watched. Every hair on my arms stood up beneath my flannel shirt. I kept cutting, trying to ignore it. In the woods, your mind can play tricks on you, especially in the dim light of dawn. I'd felt similar things before when a deer or elk was nearby, watching curiously. But this was different. This was heavy, intense, like the weight of someone's stare was physically pressing against my back. I kept cutting for another minute, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Finally, I stopped the saw and turned around, scanning the forest behind me. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just trees, underbrush, the usual forest scenery gradually becoming visible in the growing dawn light. Then my eyes caught movement about 50 yards away, and I looked up. I had to look up. Way up, standing between two massive firs, was a silhouette that made my blood freeze. It was enormous, taller than any man I'd ever seen. Even at that distance, I could tell it stood at least 8, maybe 9 feet tall. The proportions were all wrong for a human. The shoulders were too broad, the arms too long. It stood perfectly still, just watching me. I couldn't make out details in the dim light, just its massive outline, darker than the shadowed forest behind it. But I could feel its eyes on me. My first instinct was to run, but 40 years of experience had taught me that sudden movements can trigger predators. So I just stood there, heart hammering in my chest, and then slowly turned back to my saw. I acted like I hadn't seen it, like I was just taking a normal break to check something on my equipment. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the handles. I started cutting again, trying to focus on the wood in front of me rather than the creature I knew was standing in the trees. The saw's roar felt reassuring, a man-made thunder that should scare away any animal. After about 15 seconds, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to look. I turned my head slightly, glancing back toward where the figure had been standing. It was gone. That was worse, somehow. At least when I could see it, I knew where it was. Now it could be anywhere. I killed the saw immediately. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by my ragged breathing and the distant call of a crow. I stood absolutely still, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no breaking branches, no breathing other than my own. I grabbed my still-running chainsaw by the front handle, not even bothering to shut it off properly. I just needed a weapon, something with reach and teeth. Then I ran. I didn't run directly back the way I'd come. Instinct told me to move at an angle away from where the creature had been standing. I crashed through the underbrush, saw still idling in my hand, its weight becoming more noticeable with each step. The ground sloped downward, and I half ran, half slid down toward the logging road where we'd parked the crew vehicle. I reached the truck, fumbled the door open, and threw myself inside. The saw went on the passenger seat, still running until I finally had the presence of mind to reach over and kill the engine. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage it. Dale was somewhere in the woods, unaware. I leaned on the horn, 3 long blasts followed by 3 short ones, our emergency signal. Then I leaned on it again and again, not caring if I drained the battery. It took about 5 minutes before I saw Dale emerging from the trees, running full tilt toward the truck. He didn't have his saw with him. He yanked the door open and jumped in beside me, slamming it shut behind him. "What happened? You hurt," he panted, looking me over for injuries. "Drive," I said, my voice sounding strange even to myself. "Just drive. Now." "What's going on?" Dale asked, but he was already turning the key in the ignition. "I saw something up there," I said as the truck's engine roared to life. "Something big, standing on two legs, watching me." Dale's face, already flushed from running, went pale. He threw the truck into gear and stomped on the gas, sending us fishtailing down the dirt road. "Which way?" he asked. "Away from here. Just go." He didn't question me further, just drove, taking the fastest route out. We didn't just drive back to the main staging area, we drove completely past our worksite, heading for the main highway. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The adrenaline was so intense I thought I might throw up. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Dale kept checking the rearview mirror. Finally, when we hit pavement and were a good 10 miles from the cut site, Dale pulled over and put the truck in park. He was breathing hard, like he'd just run a marathon. "I didn't see what you saw," he said finally, "but I felt it." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I was fueling up my saw when I got this feeling. Like something was watching me, made the hair on my neck stand up. I tried to ignore it, but it got worse. Then I heard your saw moving through the trees, not cutting, just moving fast. I knew something was wrong, so I started running. Felt like something was chasing me the whole way down." We sat in silence for a moment. "Left my damn saw up there?" Dale said finally. "Mine's right here," I replied, nodding toward the still warm stile on the seat between us. "We need to go back and get mine, and finish the job." Dale didn't sound convinced by his own words. "Not today," I said firmly. "Not today." We both called in sick for the next 3 days. I told the foreman we had food poisoning from some bad takeout. He didn't question it. We were both reliable workers who rarely missed a day. On the 4th day, I went back alone to retrieve Dale's equipment. I brought my rifle with me, something I'd never done before. The woods felt different now. The trees that had always been my livelihood, my second home, now seemed to conceal threats in every shadow. I found Dale's saw right where he'd left it, next to a half-cut log. I grabbed it and the gas can, then made my way to where I'd been working that morning. I needed to see the spot again in broad daylight. The massive Douglas fir was still there, partially bucked into sections. My work had been neat and precise until the point where I'd fled. I looked toward where I'd seen the figure standing. In daylight, it was just another patch of forest. Nothing unusual about it, but I knew what I'd seen. I finished retrieving our equipment but never went back to finish cutting those trees. The company sent another crew to complete the job. I heard later that they'd finished without incident, but also that they'd worked exclusively in pairs, never alone, and had wrapped up each day well before dusk. Dale quit 2 weeks later, said he was moving to California to work construction with his brother-in-law. We keep in touch. He sends Christmas cards, but he's never worked in the timber industry again. As for me, I kept cutting. I still do. But I've changed how I work. I used to give 100% of my attention to the task at hand, the cut, the saw, the tree. Now I keep at least 25% of my focus on watching my surroundings. My productivity has dropped, but I've never again felt that cold sensation of being watched. The other guys notice. They see me constantly scanning the woods, checking over my shoulder. They probably think I'm getting jumpy in my old age. I don't tell them what happened. What would be the point? Either they'd believe me and be scared to work, or they wouldn't and would think I'm crazy. Neither outcome helps anyone. I still love the mountains and the timber. The smell of fresh-cut wood and two-stroke exhaust is still the sweetest combination I know. But I've accepted a harsh truth that most men who work in the wilderness eventually learn. Out there in those deep woods, I am not the alpha male. There are things in this world that we don't understand. Things that have been here longer than us, and will be here long after we're gone. Sometimes at night, when I'm lying in bed trying to sleep, I see that silhouette again in my mind. standing impossibly tall among the trees, watching me with unseen eyes, and I wonder if it's still out there, near Mount Curry, watching other men who venture into its territory. I wonder if someday someone else will see it, not in the dim dawn light, but in the clear light of day, and I wonder what they'll do when they do. As for me, I keep my saw sharp, my wits sharper, and my eyes always moving, because I know now that the forest has its own rules, its own hierarchy. And in the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest, humans aren't at the top of that chain, not by a long shot. Story 4. I still remember every detail of that night in April 1974. We were camping at Patrick's Point State Park in California, my mom, my brother Dale, and me. I was 7 years old. The trip was supposed to be fun, my first real camping experience. Mom had borrowed Uncle Jim's GMC van for the weekend, saying it would be more comfortable than sleeping in a tent. We'd arrived Friday afternoon. The park ranger at the entrance booth had given us a map of the campground and circled our spot with a red marker. Mom drove slowly along the narrow road, winding through towering redwoods until we found our designated area. It was nestled in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides, with a picnic table and fire pit. "This is perfect," Mom had said, parking the van so the sliding door faced the clearing. "We can leave the door open at night and feel like we're sleeping outdoors but still have protection if it rains." We spent that afternoon exploring the tide pools at Agate Beach, collecting smooth stones and watching tiny crabs scuttle between rocks. After sunset, we roasted hot dogs over the campfire, and Mom told ghost stories that made Dale and me huddle closer to her. When the fire died down to glowing embers, we crawled into the van and settled into our sleeping bags, Mom in the back, Dale in the middle, and me closest to the door. I remember feeling excited as I drifted off, listening to the strange forest sounds all around us. I don't know what woke me. It must have been around 2 a.m. The van's sliding door was partly open, letting in the cool night air and silvery moonlight. I lay still for a moment, disoriented, trying to remember where I was. My sleeping bag felt damp with dew. Dale snored softly beside me, and Mom was a dark shape at the far end of the van. That's when I noticed something was wrong. There was a stillness to the forest that hadn't been there earlier. No crickets chirping, no rustling leaves, just heavy silence. I shifted in my sleeping bag and turned toward the open door, and there it stood, about 25 feet away at the edge of our campsite. At first I thought it was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, standing motionless between 2 redwoods. But as my eyes adjusted to the moonlight, I realized this was no man, not a normal one anyway. Its skin was ashy gray, almost luminous in the moonlight. I could see it clearly because it wasn't wearing clothes, at least not that I could tell. The creature stood upright on 2 legs, its arms hanging at its sides, staring directly at our van, at me. I froze, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The creature didn't move either. We just stared at each other across that small clearing. Its face, I'll never forget that face. Everything about it was wrong. The eyes were too high on the head, bold and intense, reflecting the moonlight like an animal's. They were fixed on me with an intelligence that made my stomach knot. Below them was a nose, but then came this unnaturally long space before the mouth began. A huge mouth with visible teeth that were large, blocky, and spaced apart like piano keys. What disturbed me most was the top of its head. There was no forehead at all. Instead, the head rose to a rounded crest, like a triangle with the point smoothed off. Short hair covered this crest, coming forward and stopping at where a brow should be, except around the eyes, where the hair blended into the face. I noticed patches of hairless skin around its eyes and upper nose. Its chest was enormous, with prominent muscles that flexed slightly with each breath. More muscles bulged on its shoulders and arms. In the center of its chest, I could see a patch of bare skin where no hair grew. For what felt like an eternity, We remained locked in this silent standoff. The creature made no attempt to approach the van, and I was too terrified to move. I felt a weird sense that it was as wary of me as I was of it, like two animals sizing each other up. Finally, I managed to tear my gaze away. I reached over and shook Dale's shoulder. "Dale," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Wake up!" Dale grunted and rolled over. I shook him harder. "Mom," I called, a little louder this time, "there's someone outside." When I looked back toward the clearing, the creature was retreating. Its movement was strange, not quite walking, but a silent, fluid motion that seemed too graceful for its bulky frame. It slipped between the trees with surprising agility, its gray form gradually disappearing into the darkness of the forest. I lay awake for hours, straining my eyes and ears for any sign of its return. Every shadow looked like its silhouette. Every snap of a twig sent fresh adrenaline coursing through my veins. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell into a fitful sleep just before dawn. The next morning, I told Mom about what I'd seen. "There was an ugly man watching us last night," I said as she boiled water for instant coffee on the camping stove. "What do you mean, honey?" She looked concerned, pouring the steaming water into a mug. "I woke up and saw him standing right there." I pointed to the spot between the trees. He had gray skin and weird eyes and teeth. Mom frowned and glanced around the campsite. "You were probably dreaming, sweetie, but I'll mention it to the camp host when we check out, just in case." She did ask the elderly man at the ranger station if there had been any reports of strangers in the campground. He shook his head and said everything had been quiet all week. No other campers had mentioned anything unusual. "Just a bad dream," Mom reassured me as we loaded our things into the van. "Probably from those ghost stories I told." I didn't argue, but I knew what I'd seen wasn't a dream. The memory of those eyes staring at me was too vivid, too real. Life went on. We moved to Sacramento that summer, and Mom got a job at the public library. I started second grade at a new school and made new friends. But I never forgot about that night at Patrick's Point. Then, about 6 months after our camping trip, I was helping Mom unpack boxes of books for our new bookshelf when I found it. A paperback with a worn cover titled, "Do Abominable Snowmen of America Really Exist?" I pulled it out and started flipping through the pages. "Mom, what's an abominable snowman?" I asked, studying a crude drawing that made my skin prickle with recognition. She glanced up from the box she was sorting. "Oh, that's like Bigfoot. You know, like a hairy man who lives in the woods. Some people think they're real, but most folks say they're just stories." I stared at the illustrations in the book, drawings of tall, muscular creatures with crested heads and pronounced brows. One showed a face with a long gap between nose and mouth, just like what I'd seen. The text described sightings in Northern California forests, including areas near where we had camped. That's when it hit me. What I'd seen that night wasn't a man at all. It was a Bigfoot. The realization didn't frighten me as much as confirm what I'd always known, that my experience had been real. "I saw one," I said quietly, turning the book so Mum could see. "This is what I saw at Patrick's Point." Mom sat down beside me and examined the page. For a moment, she looked like she might dismiss it again, but something in my expression must have convinced her. "You really believe you saw this, don't you?" she asked. I nodded. I know I did. She didn't say I was wrong this time. Instead, she put her arm around me and said, "Well, honey, I guess the world has more mysteries than we realize." That moment changed something in me. I became obsessed with finding out more about what I'd seen. I checked out every book on Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and other cryptids from the library. I started a scrapbook of newspaper articles about unexplained sightings. My bedroom walls were soon covered with maps, marking reported encounters across the Pacific Northwest. By the time I reached high school, I'd become more circumspect about my interest. I learned quickly that talking openly about Bigfoot was an invitation for ridicule. My collection of evidence and research moved from my walls to folders hidden in my closet, but I never stopped believing. During my junior year, I convinced two friends, Tommy Baker and Steve Wilcox, to go camping with me near where my encounter had happened. We told our parents we were going fishing at Lake Tahoe, technically not a lie, since we did bring fishing gear. But our real goal was to search for evidence of Bigfoot. We set up camp about 3 miles from Patrick's Point, deep in the forest where few hikers ventured. I brought a tape recorder, hoping to capture the vocalizations that witnesses described in the books I'd read. Tommy brought his dad's Polaroid camera. Steve, who remained skeptical, brought an extra 6-pack of beer and said the only monster we'd find would be our hangovers. The first 2 nights yielded nothing except mosquito bites and ghost stories around the campfire. On the 3rd night, I woke to the sound of heavy footsteps circling our tent. The footfalls were slow, deliberate, too heavy for a deer, too rhythmic for a bear. I nudged Tommy awake, pressing my finger to my lips to keep him quiet. "Listen," I whispered. His eyes widened as the footsteps continued, now accompanied by what sounded like breathing, deep, rumbling breaths just outside the thin nylon of our tent. I fumbled for the tape recorder and pressed record, my hands shaking. Steve was still asleep, snoring softly. For 10 agonizing minutes, the presence circled our campsite. Something brushed against the tent, making the whole structure shudder. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sounds retreated into the forest. When morning came, we found large, bare footprints in the soft earth around our tent. They were 17 inches long, with 5 distinct toes and a depth that suggested something very heavy had made them. Steve didn't joke about monsters anymore. We packed up and left that day, cutting our trip short by 2 days. The tape recording captured the footsteps and breathing, but nothing conclusive enough to convince skeptics. The footprints had been smudged by our own tracks as we hurriedly packed up camp. But for me, it was further confirmation of what I already knew. Over the years, I returned to the forests of Northern California dozens of times, sometimes alone, sometimes with fellow enthusiasts I met through Bigfoot conferences and online forums. I never again had an encounter as clear and prolonged as that first night in the GMC van, but there were moments, glimpses of movement, strange sounds in the darkness, once even a large shadow that seemed to watch me from across a ravine before melting into the trees. I'm 57 now. My hair is graying, and my knees protest when I hike the rough terrain of the Pacific Northwest. But I still go out there, still searching. My wife accompanies me sometimes, though she's more interested in bird watching than Bigfoot hunting. My 2 kids grew up on my stories, and my daughter has become something of a believer herself. Scientific consensus has never accepted the existence of Bigfoot, despite thousands of reported sightings and the occasional blurry photograph or contested footprint cast. The academic world dismisses creatures like the one I saw as folklore, misidentifications, or hoaxes. But I know what I saw that night in Patrick's Point. I remember those eyes studying me with an intelligence that was both wild and eerily familiar. I recall the way it moved, retreating into the forest with a grace that belied its size. That wasn't a man in a costume or a bear standing on its hind legs. It was something else, something that shares our world but remains just beyond our understanding. Last month, I took my 10-year-old grandson camping at Patrick's Point. We stayed in a tent, not a van, and set it up near the spot where I'd had my encounter all those years ago. As we sat by the campfire roasting marshmallows, he asked me to tell him the story again. "Did you really see Bigfoot, Grandpa?" he asked, his eyes wide with wonder. "I really did," I told him, watching the shadows dance at the edge of the firelight. "And maybe someday, if you keep your eyes open and your mind ready, you might see one too." I don't know if he'll ever have his own encounter. Part of me hopes he will, just so he'll know I wasn't spinning tales. But another part hopes the creature remains elusive, keeping its secrets in the deep woods where some mysteries still roam free from human interference. As for me, I'll keep going back to those forests. Not because I need to prove anything to others. That stopped mattering to me long ago. I go because somewhere in those ancient redwoods, a grey-skinned being with bold eyes and a crested head continues to exist, regardless of whether science acknowledges it. And in some strange way, knowing that has made my world larger, more wondrous, and infinitely more interesting. That night in 1974 didn't just make me a believer in Bigfoot, it made me a believer in possibilities. Shimo. Story 5. I nearly forgot about it, but some things get their hooks in you deep. They wait for decades, quiet-like, then jerk you back. It was 1977, spring, when the air still holds a chill but the ground's gone soft. I was 13 then, living with my folks and my little sister Jenny on our farm in Humboldt County, southeastern Iowa. 110 acres, mostly corn, with Crooked Creek cutting through the bottom fields. The school bus dropped me at the county road around 3:30 that afternoon. Jenny had band practice, so she'd be on the later bus. Our mailbox stood at the head of our long gravel lane, a quarter-mile stretch between that rusty box and our farmhouse. Most days, I didn't mind the walk. That day, I wish I'd run. The sky was clear, one of those perfect spring days when everything smells like dirt and new growth. Birds were going crazy in the trees. I had my backpack slung over one shoulder, math homework I was dreading, and mud caking my sneakers from yesterday's rain. I remember checking the mailbox first. Bill, farm catalogue, something for Mom. I stuffed them in my bag and started down our lane. To the right, fields stretched toward the creek. To the left, a line of trees bordered old Mrs. Hanson's property. She lived alone in a single-wide trailer about 50 feet from the tree line. I could just see the corner of her roof from where I walked. That's when I noticed it. At first, my brain didn't understand what my eyes were seeing. Something dark was standing at the edge of the trees. Something big. I stopped walking. The gravel crunched under my feet one last time, then silence. It was examining a tree branch, reaching up with long arms to touch the new leaves, standing fully upright. On two legs, my throat closed up. The creature was massive, 7, maybe 8 feet tall. It was covered completely in dark fur, almost black, but with brownish patches where the sunlight hit. Not a bear, not a man in a costume, not anything I'd ever seen before. I froze completely. My legs wouldn't move. I couldn't even blink. I just stood there, clutching my backpack strap so tight my knuckles went white. The thing shifted its weight from one leg to the other, still focused on the branches. Its movements were smooth, deliberate, human-like, but not human. It had a head that sat directly on broad shoulders, no neck that I could see. The arms hung longer than a person's would, ending in what looked like hands, not paws. 5 minutes. That's how long I stood there. Maybe longer. I counted my heartbeats to keep from screaming. I was sure if I made a sound, it would turn, it would see me. I prayed harder than I ever had in my life. Please don't let it turn around. Please don't let it see me. Please, God, let me get home. The wind shifted, blowing from behind me toward the trees. The creature's head lifted slightly. It sniffed the air. I stopped breathing entirely. Then it moved, not toward me, thank God, but into the tree line. It didn't rush or crash through the underbrush. It just walked in, calm as anything, and disappeared into the shadows between the trunks. I counted to 30. Nothing moved in the trees. I sucked in a breath and ran. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, past the spot where it had been standing, past Mrs. Hanson's trailer, all the way down our lane, gravel flying behind me, lungs burning, not daring to look back once. I burst through our kitchen door, letting it slam against the wall. Mom wasn't home yet from her shift at the hospital. Dad would be napping upstairs before evening chores. We had rules about Dad's nap. Never, ever wake him unless the barn was on fire. I took the stairs 2 at a time and pounded on his door. "Dad! Dad! Wake up!" I heard him groan, then the creak of the bed as he sat up. "Abby? What the hell's going on?" His voice was thick with sleep. I pushed the door open. Dad was sitting on the edge of the bed in his undershirt and work pants, hair sticking up on one side. "There's something out there," I said, the words tumbling out. "By the trees near Mrs. Hanson's. It was huge, Dad. Standing up like a person." He rubbed his face. "What are you talking about? Does Iowa have bears? Bears that walk on their back legs all the time?" That got his attention. Dad had grown up hunting these woods. He knew what belonged here and what didn't. "No," he said, suddenly alert. "No bears around here, not for decades, and they don't stay on 2 legs. He studied my face. "You're serious, aren't you?" I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Dad stood up, reached under the bed, and pulled out his Winchester rifle. He checked it was loaded, then grabbed his flannel shirt from the chair. "Show me," he said. We went downstairs. Dad laced up his boots while I stood by the door, jittery and scared. "How big?" he asked. "Taller than you. 7 feet, maybe more. Covered in dark fur. It was looking at tree branches like it was searching for something." He nodded, processing. Dad wasn't one to dismiss things just because they sounded crazy. That's why I trusted him. We were halfway down the porch steps when we heard screaming from the lane. Jenny came tearing around the bend, her face white as a sheet, her school backpack bouncing wildly behind her. "Dad! Dad!" she shrieked. Dad ran to meet her, rifle in hand. He caught her as she nearly collapsed. "There's a big black thing," she gasped between sobs. "By the trees, big as a truck." Dad looked at me, his face grim. "Where exactly?" he asked Jenny. She pointed back the way she'd come. "Near Mrs. Hanson's. It was standing there, looking at the trees." The same spot, the exact same spot where I'd seen it. Dad straightened up. "Both of you stay here. Lock the door." "No!" I grabbed his arm. "Don't go alone." He considered this. "All right, we'll take the truck, but you stay inside it, you hear me?" We piled into Dad's blue Ford pickup. The rifle lay across his lap as he drove slowly down our lane. Jenny sat between us, still shaking. I kept my eyes fixed on the tree line, scanning for movement. Dad stopped the truck about 100 yards from where I'd seen the creature. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the gravel. "Stay put," he ordered, then climbed out, rifle ready. I watched through the windshield as he moved cautiously toward the trees, stopping every few steps to listen and look around. He examined the ground near where I'd pointed, then moved closer to the tree line. After 10 minutes, he returned to the truck. "Nothing there now," he said. "Ground's too hard right here to show prints." But something broke some branches about 8 feet up. He glanced toward Mrs. Hanson's trailer. "Going to check on Edna." We drove the short distance to Mrs. Hanson's. She came to the door in her flowered house dress, surprised to see us. "Everything all right, Frank?" she asked my dad. "Just checking in, Edna. Girls thought they saw something unusual near your place, a big animal." She adjusted her glasses. "Haven't seen anything. Been watching my shows all afternoon." Dad nodded. "You notice anything strange lately? Noises at night? Animals acting up?" She thought about it. "Well, my chickens were raising a fuss last night. Thought it might be a raccoon. You keep your doors locked now, you hear, and call us if you need anything." She agreed, looking confused but not alarmed. Dad didn't tell her what we'd seen, probably thought she'd think we were crazy. We drove back home in silence. When we got there, Dad sat us down at the kitchen table. "Tell me again," he said. "Both of you. Every detail." We did. Our descriptions matched perfectly, the height, the dark fur, the way it examined the tree branches. The only difference was, Jenny said she thought she saw its face when it turned slightly. something like a flattened nose and deep-set eyes. Dad listened without interrupting. When we finished, he nodded slowly. "I want you both to start carrying whistles," he said, "and no walking the lane alone for a while. I'll pick you up at the bus stop." "What do you think it was?" I asked. He rubbed his chin. "Not sure. Could be someone playing a prank. Could be." He trailed off. "A monster," Jenny whispered. "No such thing as monsters," Dad said automatically. But I noticed he didn't put his rifle away. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old farmhouse had me sitting bolt upright. I kept picturing those long arms reaching up to the tree branches. What if it came to my window? What if it was looking for me? Dad started driving us to and from the bus stop. He searched the woods near our property, finding nothing but some broken branches and, once, a strange pile of twigs that wasn't made by any animal he recognized. After 2 weeks with no further sightings, life mostly returned to normal. Dad still checked the property lines regularly. Mum kept the doors locked even during the day. Jenny and I started walking the lane together again, but only in broad daylight, and always with Dad's whistles around our necks. Summer came. The corn grew tall. We got busy with farm work and summer activities. The memory faded, but never completely disappeared. Years passed. I went to college, got married, moved to Cedar Rapids. Jenny stayed closer to home. Dad and Mum kept the farm going until they retired and sold most of the acreage. In 2011, I was visiting them in their smaller place when a show called Finding Bigfoot came on TV. Mum wanted to change the channel. "Bunch of nonsense," she said. But Dad and I kept watching. They showed footprint casts, talked about sightings across the country, described creatures that sounded eerily familiar. "Remember that thing we saw?" I asked Dad quietly. He nodded, eyes still on the screen. "Never did figure out what that was." "You believe me, even now?" "Always did," he said simply. "Both you girls saw the same thing, same place. Jenny wasn't copying you. She came straight from the bus. Whatever it was real enough." Later, after Mum went to bed, Dad told me something he'd never mentioned before. He'd asked around, carefully, in the years after our sighting. Found out there were other stories. Not many, just whispers at the feed store or the diner. Strange sightings near the rivers and creeks. Some of the older folks in the area had a name for it. "Momo," Dad said. "That's what they called it around here. Short for Missouri Monster, I guess. Though we're in Iowa, supposed to be some kind of wild man or creature. Been stories about it since I was a boy." I felt a chill despite the warm room. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" He shrugged. "Didn't want to scare you more than you already were, and honestly I didn't know what to make of it. Still don't." That night I dreamed of standing frozen on a gravel lane, watching something impossibly tall and dark examining tree branches. Only this time, in my dream, it turned around. I woke up before I could see its face. I'm 49 now. I've got teenagers of my own. Sometimes when we drive back to visit family in Iowa, we pass near our old farm. The house is still there, though different people live in it now. The lane looks shorter than I remember. I never walk it alone. I've never told my kids about what Jenny and I saw that spring day in 1977. They'd probably think it was just an overactive imagination or a bear that wandered too far from its normal territory. Maybe they'd be right. But sometimes when I'm out in the woods, I find myself scanning the tree lines, looking for movement, listening for heavy footsteps, and I always watch the branches. Story 6. I've been hunting these river bottoms for 45 years. Know every creek, gully, and game trail from the county line to Possum Junction. My daddy taught me these woods, just like his daddy taught him. We Caldwells have been on this land since before Arkansas was even a state. I thought I'd seen everything these bottoms could show a man. I was wrong. January 20th, 2010. Started like any other winter morning in Pope County. Cold enough to see your breath, but not bitter. Sky clear as tap water. I climbed into my Ford F-150 around 2:30 in the afternoon, planning to check on my cattle in the south pasture. My buddy Earl Simmons rode shotgun, like he'd done hundreds of times before. "Cattle check?" Earl asked, settling his worn John Deere cap on his grey head. "Yep. Want to make sure that new fence is holding up after the rain we got." I pulled onto Old Creek Road, tires crunching on the gravel. Earl nodded, staring out at the winter bare fields. He'd been my hunting partner since high school, and at 62, we both still loved these woods, even if our knees complained more than they used to. We drove in comfortable silence for about 15 minutes. When we crossed the state highway, I slowed near the utility right-of-way that cut through the property like a ruler line. I always stopped here. Force of habit. The power company kept this strip clear, and it made a perfect wildlife viewing corridor. "Mind if we watch a minute?" I asked, though I was already pulling over. Earl chuckled. "Like you need to ask." I killed the engine. This spot gave us a clear view down nearly 800 yards of open land before it hit the tree line. Used to hunt here all the time before the Wilkinson family bought it up and posted it. "Remember that 10-pointer I got right down there?" I pointed toward a bend in the tree line. "Hell yes. 1992, wasn't it? Biggest rack I'd seen that season." I nodded, scanning the edge where field met forest. The bottoms were quiet today. A few crows worked the field to our left, and I could see where deer had been moving along the tree line. That's when I noticed it. "Hold up," I said, leaning forward. "There's something moving down there." About 500 yards away, right where the trees met the clearing, something was walking. My first thought was trespasser, maybe a hunter who didn't respect the posted signs. "You see that?" I asked. Earl squinted. "Yeah. Someone walking?" I frowned, watching the figure move. "I don't think so." Something wasn't right. The figure looked too tall, too uniform in color. It moved with a strange gait that didn't match a human stride. "Hand me my binocs," I said, not taking my eyes off the figure. Earl reached into the glove box and passed me my Bushnells. I raised them to my eyes and adjusted the focus. The breath froze in my lungs. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. Through the binoculars, I could clearly see it wasn't a person, not even close. The thing was walking on two legs, sure enough, but it stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It had massive shoulders, broader than any man I'd ever seen, and its torso narrowed at the waist like a bodybuilder's, but more extreme. Its arms hung down its sides, hands nearly reaching its knees. Most disturbing was what it carried. Slung over its right shoulder was a carcass, looked like a small hog, or maybe a big dog. "Earl," I said, my voice tight, "get my rifle from behind the seat." "What is it?" he asked, already reaching for my Remington. "I don't know." He handed me the rifle, and I braced it on the open window, looking through the scope. The 3.40 Leupold gave me an even clearer view, and what I saw made my skin crawl. The creature was covered in hair, not fur, but long, stringy hair like wet straw, burnt brown in color. Its proportions were all wrong. The legs were too long, the stride too wide. With each step, it swung its left arm in a wide arc, as if balancing itself. "Jesus Christ!" I breathed. "What?" Earl demanded. "What do you see?" "It ain't human," I said, "and it ain't no bear walking upright." Earl grabbed the binoculars from the seat where I'd dropped them. I kept the scope trained on the creature, watching its fluid movement. It walked with purpose, heading parallel to the tree line. "Holy shit," Earl whispered after a moment. "Ray, what the hell is that thing?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. In all my years in these woods, I'd never seen anything like it. The creature moved with a quick, efficient stride, covering ground faster than a man could walk without running. Its head sat directly on those massive shoulders, no neck that I could see. "It's carrying something," Earl said. "Hog, I think, or a dog." We watched in silence as the creature continued along the tree line for about 300 yards. Then, without hesitation, it stepped into the woods and disappeared. I lowered the rifle, my hands shaking slightly. Earl looked at me. "You ever seen anything like that before?" I shook my head. "Never." We sat there for several minutes, staring at the spot where the creature had vanished. Neither of us spoke. What was there to say? We'd just seen something impossible. Finally, Earl broke the silence. "We going after it?" I turned to look at him. "Are you crazy? You want to follow that thing into the woods?" "Well, we can't just pretend we didn't see it." I started the truck. "We're not going after it. Not today, anyway. You believe in Bigfoot, Ray?" Earl asked as we pulled back onto the road. "I didn't," I said, "until about 5 minutes ago." We drove to check my cattle in silence, both lost in our thoughts. The cows were fine, the fence intact, but I barely noticed. My mind kept replaying what we'd seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold, staring out the window at the dark tree line a quarter-mile from my house. Was that thing out there right now? How long had it been living in our woods without us knowing? The next morning, I called Sheriff Dalton. I've known Jim Dalton since he was a rookie deputy. He took my call right away. "Ray, what can I do for you?" he asked. "Jim, I need to report something I saw yesterday. Something unusual." "Go ahead." I told him everything. Where we were, what we saw, every detail I could remember. When I finished, silence stretched across the line. "You there, Jim?" He cleared his throat. "Yeah, I'm here." "Ray, you sure about what you saw? Couldn't have been a bear?" "Jim, I've hunted bear in 3 states. This wasn't a bear. It walked on 2 legs the whole time, moved nothing like a bear." Another pause. "You're not the first, Ray," he finally said, his voice lower. "What do you mean?" "Had a report last month from Bill Mercer over on Cypress Creek. Said he saw something similar when he was running his trapline. And about 3 years back, the Johnson girls saw something on their way home from school. Tall, hairy creature that ran across the road near the old Campbell place." My skin prickled. "You're telling me these things have been around for years?" "My granddaddy used to talk about the tall men in the bottoms. Said his daddy warned him about them too. Always figured it was just stories to keep kids from wandering too far into the swamp." I thought about that. Thought about my own grandfather had told tales of strange things in the deepest parts of the bottomland, places where the sun barely reached through the cypress canopy. I'd always dismissed them as campfire stories. "What should we do?" I asked. "Nothing to do," Jim said. "File a report, I guess. But I'm not sending deputies out looking for something like that. Not without more to go on." After hanging up, I called Earl. We agreed to go back to the spot the next day, not to hunt the creature, but to look for evidence. Tracks, hair, anything that might prove what we saw was real. Morning came cold and clear. Earl arrived at 7:30 carrying his .30-06 and a camera. "You really think we'll find anything?" he asked as we drove toward the highway. "Don't know, but we have to look." We parked at the same spot and walked down the utility right-of-way, our breath fogging in the morning air. The ground was still soft from recent rain, good for tracking. We reached the area where we'd first spotted the creature. I moved slowly, eyes scanning the ground. Earl did the same, working a parallel course about 20 feet to my left. "Ray," he called after about 10 minutes. "Got something here." I joined him at the tree line. Earl pointed to the ground where a clear impression marked the soft earth. A footprint, but like none I'd ever seen. It was huge, at least 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toe marks. The impression was deep, suggesting whatever made it was heavy. "That's not human," I said unnecessarily. "And not bear," Earl added. "Bears don't leave prints like this." We found 3 more tracks, each similar to the first. They led into the woods, just where we'd seen the creature disappear. Earl photographed each print, placing his hunting knife beside them for scale. "We following these?" he asked, nodding toward the dark woods. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to leave it alone, to get back in the truck and forget what we'd seen. But another part of me, the part that had spent a lifetime tracking and hunting, needed to know. Just a little ways, I decided. We stay together, and we turn back at the first sign of trouble. Earl nodded grimly, checking his rifle. The tracks led us into the bottomland forest. Ancient cypress and tupelo gum trees towered overhead, their branches twisting together to block the sunlight. The ground grew softer, wetter. The tracks remained clear, each stride measuring nearly 5 feet. We followed them for about a quarter mile before they disappeared at the edge of a slough, a swampy pond choked with vegetation. The water was dark, still as glass. "Lost the trail," Earl said. I nodded, scanning the opposite shore about 30 yards away. It either went through the water or along the edge. We stood there, listening to the silence of the swamp. No birds called, no frogs croaked. The bottomland was unnaturally quiet. "You feel that?" Earl whispered. I did. A prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the feeling of being watched. Slowly I turned, scanning the trees behind us. Nothing moved, but the feeling remained. "We should go," I said quietly. Earl didn't argue. We backed away from the slough, keeping our rifles ready. The entire way back to the truck, I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on us, following our every move. Back in the safety of the F-150, Earl showed me the photos he'd taken of the tracks. They were clear, unmistakable evidence of something large and bipedal. "What now?" he asked. "I know someone we should talk to." Dr. Marcus Fleming taught biology at the community college in Russellville. He'd written articles about cryptozoology, the study of hidden animals, though he maintained a skeptic's approach. I'd met him at a conservation meeting years back and had his number in my contacts. He agreed to meet us that afternoon at the college. We brought Earl's camera and our story. Dr. Fleming studied the photos carefully, his expression giving nothing away. He was a tall, lean man with a neatly trimmed beard and intense eyes. "These are interesting," he finally said. "Very interesting." "You know what made them?" I asked. "I can tell you what didn't make them," he replied. "Not human, not bear, not any known animal in these parts." He looked up at us. "You gentlemen seem level-headed. Not the type to make up stories or misidentify common wildlife." "We know what we saw," Earl said firmly. Dr. Fleming nodded. "I've collected reports from this region for 20 years. Your account matches at least a dozen others. The height, the hair, the long arms. There's consistency across sightings that's hard to dismiss." "So you believe us?" I asked. "Let's say I don't disbelieve you." He smiled slightly. "The bottomlands of Arkansas contain some of the least explored terrain in the eastern United States. Deep swamps, dense forests, perfect habitat for something to remain hidden." "You think there's more than one?" Earl asked. Dr. Fleming leaned back in his chair. "If what you saw is real, and I'm not saying it isn't, then yes, there would have to be a breeding population. A single creature couldn't survive for decades." The thought of multiple creatures like the one we'd seen sent a chill through me. "There's something else," I said. "Sheriff Dalton mentioned other reports in the same area." Dr. Fleming nodded. "I've documented 3 distinct clusters of sightings within Pope County. One centers almost exactly where you had your encounter." He pulled out a county map and pointed to an area along the river bottoms. "Here, here, and here. Reports going back over 100 years. I stared at the map. One of the clusters was less than a mile from my own property. "What should we do?" I asked. "That depends on what you want," Dr. Fleming replied. "If you're looking to prove these creatures exist, you'd need more than footprints and a sighting. You'd need clear photographs, DNA evidence, or even a specimen. I'm not looking to kill one, if that's what you mean," I said firmly. "Good. Neither am I." Dr. Fleming folded the map. But if you're willing, I'd like to place some trail cameras in the area, see if we can capture image evidence. Earl and I exchanged glances. We can do that, I said. Over the next 2 weeks, we helped Dr. Fleming set up trail cameras around the slough and along the utility corridor. I found myself driving past the spot almost daily, scanning the tree line, hoping for another glimpse. It was on February 8th, a cold, foggy morning, when one of the trail cameras captured something. Dr. Fleming called me immediately. "Ray, we got something. Can you meet me at my office?" I was there within the hour. Earl arrived shortly after. Dr. Fleming had his computer open on his desk. "It's not clear," he warned us, "but it's definitely unusual." He turned the screen toward us. The image was grainy, taken in the pre-dawn light. A tall, dark figure stood at the edge of the frame, partially obscured by foliage. The proportions matched what we'd seen: the broad shoulders, the long arms, the strange posture. "That's it," Earl said immediately. "That's what we saw." Dr. Fleming nodded slowly. "I'm sending this to colleagues for analysis, but even they will say it's inconclusive." "But we know what it is," I said. "Yes," Dr. Fleming agreed. "I believe you do." In the weeks that followed, we captured 2 more partial images, but nothing as clear as we hoped. The creatures, if that's what they were, seemed to sense the cameras, avoiding them or staying just out of range. Spring arrived and the bottomlands transformed, leaves unfurled, underbrush thickened, and the swamps became nearly impenetrable. Our search grew more difficult as nature reclaimed the landscape. I never saw the creature again, not directly. But sometimes, driving past that utility corridor at dusk, I'd catch movement at the edge of my vision. Something tall and dark, moving with that same distinctive gait, always just disappearing into the trees as I turned to look. Earl and I still talk about what we saw that January day. Dr. Fleming continues his research, adding our encounter to his growing database of sightings. Sheriff Dalton filed our report, but never took any official action. Life in Pope County goes on much as it always has. People work, hunt, fish, and farm. But now, when old-timers tell stories about strange things in the bottomlands, I don't smile politely and dismiss them. I know better. I still hunt these woods, still check my cattle in the south pasture, but I don't go near that slough anymore, and I never venture into the deep bottoms alone. Some knowledge changes a man. Once you've seen something that shouldn't exist walking through familiar woods, those woods are never quite the same again. The creatures are still out there, watching, waiting, moving through their territory as they have for centuries, largely unseen. Sometimes at night, when the wind blows from the direction of the bottomlands, I swear I hear something moving through the trees beyond my property line. Something big that walks on 2 legs, and I keep my rifle closer than I used to. Story 7. I never meant to see it, didn't want to see it. Some things once seen can't be unseen, and they change you in ways you can't explain to folks who haven't witnessed something impossible themselves. My name's Jim Harker. I've hunted these Ozark Hills since I was 8 years old, tracking deer through misty hollows before most kids finished their morning cartoons. By 2002, I'd spent 47 years learning every creature that crawls, flies, or runs through these woods. I worked as a Park Service consultant for 15 years, helped the Game and Fish Commission with wildlife surveys, and wrote for outdoor magazines on the side. People around northwest Arkansas knew me as the guy to call when they couldn't identify tracks or scat or strange noises in the night. That reputation made what happened on Highway 23 all the harder to deal with. Who would believe me? Hell, I didn't believe me, and I saw the damn thing with my own eyes. It was October 17th, 2002. I remember the date because it was my friend Linda Powell's birthday. Linda taught 3rd grade in Clarksville, and I'd taken her up to Branson to see a show as a birthday treat. Nothing romantic between us, just old friends since high school, Her husband had passed 2 years earlier, and she didn't get out much. We'd seen some country music review, eaten a decent steak dinner, and started the drive back around 10:30 that night. The weather had turned during the show. A light rain had fallen, leaving the pavement slick and shiny under the headlights. The moon was just a sliver, and the forest pressed in dark on both sides of Highway 23 as we wound our way through the Ozark National Forest. Linda had dozed off around 11:45, her head against the passenger window of my Ford F-150. The heater hummed quietly, and I'd turned the radio down to just a whisper. That stretch of Highway 23 through Franklin County is pretty remote. We hadn't passed another car in 20 minutes. I remember checking my watch, 12:17 a.m., and calculating we'd be back in Clarksville by 1:30 if the roads stayed clear. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness as I approached a curve, the kind of bend that makes you ease off the gas just a touch. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain tried to categorize it as something familiar, a bear, standing upright maybe, or some hunter in a ghillie suit playing a dangerous prank. But I've seen hundreds of black bears in my time. This wasn't that. The thing stood dead center in my lane, about 50 yards ahead where my headlights first picked it up. It was huge. I'd estimate 8, maybe 9 feet tall. The posture struck me as odd right away. Ramrod straight from the waist up, like a soldier standing at attention, but with bent knees, as if it was preparing to move. I eased my foot off the gas, not hitting the brakes for fear of skidding on the wet pavement. My truck slowed from 60 to about 40 as my mind raced through possibilities. A man in a costume, not out here, not at midnight on a Thursday. A bear, wrong shape entirely. Too tall, too straight-backed. As the distance closed to about 30 yards, the headlights fully illuminated the figure. It was covered in dark hair, not fur exactly, but long, shaggy hair that hung from its limbs and torso. The body was wide and bulky, with no tapering from chest to waist like you'd see in a human or even a bear. Just a solid block of mass. The head is what convinced me this was something I'd never encountered before. It was shaped like a human head, but oversized, proportionally too large even for the massive body. I couldn't make out facial features, whether due to the hair, the distance, or the darkness, I don't know. What happened next defies explanation. When my truck reached about 30 yards from the figure, it moved. Not the lumbering motion of a bear or the awkward run of a person in a costume. This thing pivoted with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for something so large. One moment it faced me directly, the next it had spun 90 degrees and was sprinting toward the inside of the highway curve. "Jesus Christ!" I yelled loud enough to wake Linda. "What? What's wrong?" She startled awake, grabbing the dashboard. I didn't answer. Instead, I punched the gas pedal, tires briefly losing traction on the wet pavement before the truck surged forward. I had to see where this thing went. The curve had a steep road cut into the hillside on that side, all loose shale and sandstone. Nothing that size could climb that quickly. But as I rounded the curve, high beams sweeping the roadside, there was nothing. No movement in the brush, no figure visible on the road or the embankment. The thing had simply vanished. I pulled over, the truck's tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. "Jim, what's going on?" Linda asked, fully awake now and clearly concerned. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight, my knuckles had gone white. I was breathing hard, scanning the tree line, the road, the steep cut bank. "Did you see it?" I asked. "See what?" "That person, or whatever it was, standing in the road." Linda looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "There wasn't anybody in the road, Jim. I would have noticed before I fell asleep." "No, just now, right before you woke up. Something was standing in the middle of the highway." She shook her head. "I didn't see anything. Are you okay? Do you need me to drive?" I put the truck in park and grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment. "Wait here. I need to check something." "Jim, you're scaring me. Just give me a minute." I stepped out into the cool night air. The rain had stopped, but water still dripped from the trees. I swept my flashlight across the road looking for footprints, but the pavement was too wet to hold marks. The embankment rose sharply to my right, a mix of red clay, loose shale, and exposed sandstone. Nothing could have climbed that in seconds, especially not something so large. I walked back down the road in the direction we'd come from, scanning the ditches on both sides. About 40 yards back, I found it, a deep drainage ditch on the inside of the curve, partially hidden by tall grass. It was maybe 3 feet deep and 4 feet wide, running parallel to the road. I aimed my flashlight into the ditch, half expecting to see the creature crouched there. Nothing but wet leaves and mud. But the mud told a story. There were indentations, irregular depressions that might have been made by something large, pressing down into the soft earth. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the night air. I realized what must have happened. The thing had dropped into this ditch as our truck approached, flattening itself to avoid detection. It would have required incredible speed and coordination, and the awareness that it wanted to hide from humans. I hurried back to the truck, my boots squelching in the mud. "Find anything?" Linda asked as I climbed in, my jeans now wet to the knees. I hesitated. Linda was practical, a no-nonsense woman who dealt in facts and logic. "Just checking to make sure I didn't hit an animal," I lied. "Everything's fine." We drove the rest of the way in near silence. I dropped Linda at her house in Clarksville just before 1:30 a.m., declining her offer of coffee. My mind was too full of what I'd seen, and I needed to be alone to process it. Back at my cabin outside of Ozone, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a notepad, sketching what I'd seen while it was still fresh in my mind. The proportions, the posture, the strange, bulky frame with no taper. I compared my drawing to images of known wildlife, bears, elk, even gorillas from the encyclopedia on my bookshelf. Nothing matched. The next morning I drove back to that stretch of Highway 23, arriving around 10 a.m. In daylight, the road looked ordinary, just another winding stretch through the Ozark National Forest. I parked at approximately the same spot and walked back to the ditch. The impressions I'd seen the night before were still visible, though partially dried by the morning sun. They formed no recognizable footprint pattern, just irregularly spaced depressions in the mud. I placed my size 11 boot next to one depression for scale. It was nearly twice as long and much wider. I took photographs with my old Polaroid, then covered the depressions with a fallen branch to mask them from casual observation. I wasn't ready for anyone else to see this yet. For weeks afterward, I returned to that stretch of Highway 23 at different times, hoping for another sighting. I found nothing conclusive, though twice I discovered broken branches high up on trees where no deer or bear could reach. And once, a strange tuft of dark hair caught on a barbed wire fence that didn't match any local wildlife. I kept these samples in labeled Ziploc bags in my freezer. I told no one about what I'd seen. Not Linda, not my hunting buddies, not my contacts at the Park Service. The few times Linda asked about that night, I brushed it off as a deer or maybe fatigue from the long drive. She seemed to accept this explanation, though sometimes I caught her looking at me with concern. The truth was, I was afraid. Not of the creature itself, though that was certainly unsettling. I was afraid of what people would think. In northwest Arkansas, I had a reputation as a reliable wildlife expert. If I started talking about 9-foot hairy humanoids on Highway 23, that reputation would evaporate overnight. So I kept quiet. For 4 long years, I told exactly one person, my brother Mike, who lived in Colorado and had no connections to my life in Arkansas. He listened without judgment, but offered no explanations beyond the usual suggestions of bears or overactive imagination. Then, in late 2006, everything changed. I was reading the Arkansas Democrat Gazette when I came across a column about unexplained sightings in the Ozarks. The journalist had interviewed several people who claimed to have seen large, hair-covered creatures in remote areas of northwest Arkansas, dating back decades. One account in particular caught my attention. In 1987, a forestry worker described seeing an 8-foot-tall, dark-haired bipedal creature near White Rock Mountain, less than 20 miles from my Highway 23 encounter. The details matched what I'd seen: the unusual body proportions, the incredible speed, the apparent intelligence in avoiding detection. I read that column 3 times before folding the newspaper carefully and placing it in my desk drawer. That night, I couldn't sleep. By morning, I'd made a decision. I called the journalist, a woman named Rebecca Thornton. She agreed to meet me at a diner in Fayetteville, well away from my usual haunts. I brought my notebooks, the Polaroids, and even one of the hair samples I'd kept frozen. "You understand that going public with this could affect your professional standing," Rebecca said after I'd laid out my experience in detail. "I do," I replied, "but I'm 51 years old. I've spent my life studying wildlife in these mountains. What I saw wasn't a known animal. People should know that something else is out there." Rebecca took notes as I described the encounter again. The creature's posture, its movement, its disappearance. She seemed particularly interested in my assessment that it had deliberately hidden from us. "You're the most credible witness I've interviewed," she said finally. "Everyone else I've spoken to was passing through or had limited outdoor experience. You know what belongs in these woods and what doesn't." "That's why I kept quiet so long," I admitted. "The more you know, the harder it is to face something you can't explain." She published the story the following Sunday, using only my initials at my request. The headline read, "Wildlife Expert Encounters Unknown Creature in Ozark National Forest." The article detailed my experience on Highway 23, alongside other sightings from the region stretching back to the 1940s. The response was mixed. Some readers wrote in supporting the possibility of undiscovered species in the remote areas of the Ozarks. Others suggested I'd seen a bear with mange or suffered from highway hypnosis after the long drive. A few called me a liar outright. My phone rang constantly for 2 weeks. Old friends checking if I was okay, reporters seeking interviews, self-proclaimed cryptozoologists wanting to organize expeditions. I turned them all down. Linda called too. "It was you in that article, wasn't it?" she asked. "That night on Highway 23. "Yes," I said simply. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Would you have believed me?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I believe you saw something, Jim. I don't know what it was, but I know you well enough to know you wouldn't make this up." That meant more to me than she could know. It's been years now since that night on Highway 23. I've never seen the creature again, though I've heard from others who have had similar encounters in the same general area. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, the knowing without proof. Sometimes on clear nights, I drive that stretch of Highway 23, windows down, senses alert. I don't expect to see the creature again. Lightning rarely strikes twice, but I watch the shadows at the edge of my headlights, and I remember what I saw standing in the road that night. Something that shouldn't exist but does. Something that has likely walked these mountains since before humans built roads through them. I don't know what it was. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some undiscovered primate. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that it was real. I saw it with my own eyes, watched it move with impossible speed, understood in that moment that the world is bigger and stranger than we allow ourselves to believe. And if you're driving through the Ozark National Forest late at night, especially along Highway 23 in Franklin County, keep your eyes on the road. You might see something standing there, something tall and dark and not quite human. And if you do, remember, you're not the first, and you won't be the last. Story 8. I wasn't prepared for the storm. Nobody ever really is, I guess. The Sawtooth Range doesn't forgive mistakes, and I made plenty. The weather report called for a cold front, but I'd been planning this solo trip for months. After 3 years shuffling paperwork for Parks and Recreation in Park City, I needed this break. My boss, Dale, warned me not to go. "Shannon, you're asking for trouble heading up there this time of year," he'd said, tapping the barometric pressure reading on his phone. I brushed him off with a confident smile. I parked my Subaru at the trailhead on Friday morning. The air hung heavy and still. Dark clouds had begun stacking up against the mountain peaks to the west like a wall. I shouldered my pack, checked my map, and headed up the trail toward Kramer Lake. The hike started pleasantly enough. The trail switched back through pine forest for the first few miles. By early afternoon, the wind picked up. The temperature dropped noticeably. I zipped my jacket higher and pressed on, determined to reach the lake before sunset. When I crested the final ridge and saw Kramer Lake below, the clouds had swallowed the peaks behind me. The surface of the water looked black, reflecting the darkening sky. I hurried down to the shore and quickly set up my tent in a small clearing about 50 yards from the water's edge, partially sheltered by a stand of pines and a rocky overhang. After securing my tent and stashing my food in a bear canister, I stood at the edge of the lake, catching my breath. That's when I noticed movement on the far shore. 2 large figures stood at the water's edge. At first I thought they were other hikers, but something about their proportions seemed wrong. They were too bulky, too tall. I reached for my binoculars. Through the lenses, I could make out 2 massive, hair-covered forms. They appeared to be tossing rocks into the lake. But these weren't small stones. These were boulders that would have taken 2 strong men to lift. The figures handled them with casual ease, launching them 20 or 30 feet into the deep water. I dropped my binoculars, my hands suddenly trembling. The figures hadn't seen me. I backed slowly toward my tent, keeping my eyes fixed on them until I was inside, zipping the door shut. I told myself they were just bears standing unusually upright, or maybe elk with strange proportions distorted by the fading light. I ate a cold dinner of trail mix and jerky, not wanting to risk a fire. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. I crawled into my sleeping bag early, exhausted from the day's hike. Sleep came quickly but didn't last. The violent shaking woke me. My first thought was that a bear was attacking my tent. I shot upright, heart hammering against my ribs. But it wasn't a bear. The entire ground convulsed beneath me. The trees outside creaked and groaned. A deep rumbling sound filled the air. Earthquake. I'd experienced small tremors in Utah, but nothing like this. The shaking lasted maybe 15 seconds, though it felt much longer. When it finally stopped, an eerie silence fell, broken only by the soft patter of snow against my tent. I hadn't expected snow, at least not this much. The forecast had mentioned flurries, not a storm. I checked my watch, 2:17 a.m. I unzipped the tent door a few inches and peered out. What I saw made my stomach drop. Snow had already covered the ground to a depth of several inches, and it was coming down hard. Large, wet flakes fell in a thick curtain. The moonlight filtering through breaks in the clouds gave the landscape an otherworldly glow. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed something else. Where there had been a clear view of the hillside behind my tent, there was now a jumbled pile of rocks and debris. A rock slide had crashed down during the earthquake, stopping just yards from where I slept. If I'd pitched my tent even slightly further back from the shore, I would have been buried alive. I zipped the tent closed and huddled in my sleeping bag, shivering now from more than just the cold. There was nothing to do but wait until morning. By dawn, the snow had stopped. I opened my tent to find 18 inches of fresh powder blanketing everything. The sky had cleared, revealing a crisp blue expanse above the transformed landscape. The beauty would have been breathtaking if I hadn't been so concerned about getting down from the mountain. As I prepared a hasty breakfast of instant oatmeal, I heard it, a sound that froze the blood in my veins. A long, mournful wail echoed across the lake. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized, Too deep for a wolf, too melodic for a bear, it carried a distinctly human quality of grief that raised the hair on my arms. I scanned the opposite shore and spotted one of the figures from yesterday. Even from this distance, I could tell it was massive, at least 8 feet tall. It moved slowly along the shoreline, stopping occasionally to pick up large rocks. It was stacking them deliberately, forming what looked like a crude cairn or mound. The creature worked methodically for almost an hour. I remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Finally, it finished its task, stood before the pile of rocks for several long moments, then threw its head back and released another haunting cry that echoed off the surrounding peaks. Then it turned and disappeared into the forest. I waited 30 minutes to make sure it was gone. Reason told me to pack up and head back down the mountain immediately, but curiosity pulled me toward that rock pile. I trudged through the deep snow, circling the lake carefully, constantly scanning the tree line. When I reached the cairn, I understood immediately what I was looking at. The rocks had been piled deliberately over something. At the base of the pile, partially visible, was a foot. Not a human foot, it was too large, covered in thick brown hair. 5 toes with blackened nails protruded from beneath the lowest rocks. My mind raced to process what I was seeing. The foot was attached to someone, buried under the rock slide that must have come down on this side of the lake during the earthquake. The surviving creature had built a burial mound for its fallen companion. I backed away, suddenly feeling like an intruder at a funeral. These weren't bears, they weren't any known animal. The word formed in my mind before I could stop it. Sasquatch. Bigfoot. The legendary creature of the Pacific Northwest. I needed to get off this mountain, now. I hurried back to my campsite, packed everything in record time, and started down the trail. The snow made the going treacherous. In many places, I couldn't even see where the trail was. I post-holed through deep drifts, my hiking boots and pants quickly soaked through. After an hour of struggling through the snow, I noticed something odd. Large, clearly defined depressions led down the mountainside, roughly following the trail. Footprints, enormous footprints, at least 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. They sank deep into the snow, creating a perfect stepping path. The surviving creature had come this way, perhaps during the night while I slept. The prints were fresher than the snowfall. Without hesitation, I began following them. Each massive depression provided a solid foothold in the otherwise treacherous snow. I made better progress following this unintentional path. By midday, I'd covered maybe 3 miles. Under normal conditions, I would have been nearly back to the trailhead by now. The sun beat down on the snow, creating a blinding glare. Sweat soaked my inner layers despite the cold. My legs burned from the effort of high-stepping through the snow. The footprints continued downward, and I followed gratefully. Then, about 2 miles from where I estimated the trailhead to be, the tracks veered sharply off the trail, heading west into deeper forest. I stood at the junction, torn. The creature's path provided easier walking, but it was heading away from my destination. I decided to leave the footprints and continue what I thought was the proper route. This proved immediately more difficult. Without the compressed snow of the footprints, I sank to my knees with each step. My pace slowed to a crawl. After another hour, I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. Nothing looked familiar. The trail markers were buried under snow. I'd wandered off course, and now the sun was lowering toward the western peaks. The temperature dropped noticeably. My wet clothes began to stiffen with ice. Panic rose in my chest. I was lost in a snowbound wilderness after an earthquake, with night approaching and temperatures dropping. And somewhere out there, a grieving 8-foot-tall creature was wandering these same mountains. I stumbled forward, picking the path that seemed to lead downhill, hoping it would eventually connect with the trail or a road. My toes had gone numb. My fingers felt stiff inside my wet gloves. The first stages of hypothermia were setting in. As the light faded from the sky, I collapsed against a tree trunk. My muscles refused to carry me further. The cold had seeped into my bones. I felt a dangerous drowsiness creeping over me, the kind they warn you about in wilderness survival classes, the kind that precedes freezing to death. That's when I heard it again. That keening, mournful cry echoing through the mountains, closer now, maybe half a mile away. The creature was out there, still grieving its lost companion. Something about that sound cut through my fog of exhaustion. Here was another being experiencing pain, loss, grief, emotions I recognized. If this creature could continue after losing what might have been its family, its mate, then I could find the strength to keep moving. I pushed myself to my feet, followed the downward slope, one step, another, each one an act of will. Night had fully fallen when I spotted lights through the trees. At first, I thought my oxygen-deprived brain was hallucinating. But as I staggered closer, I made out the shape of the ranger station at the trailhead. Somehow, I'd found my way back. I practically fell through the door. The night ranger, a man named Hank Jenkins, jumped from his desk when he saw me. My appearance must have been frightening, covered in ice, blue-lipped, barely conscious. "Jesus Christ," he said, helping me to a chair near the wood stove. "Where'd you come from?" "Kramer Lake," I managed through chattering teeth. "Kramer, in this weather. We've been pulling everyone off the mountain since the earthquake hit. Didn't think anyone was still up there." He wrapped me in emergency blankets, made me hot tea, and called for medical assistance. As warmth slowly returned to my limbs, bringing with it the painful tingling of circulation, he questioned me about what happened. I told him about getting caught in the snowstorm after the earthquake, about the dangerous trek down. I said nothing about the footprints or the burial mound or the wailing cry that had given me the strength to continue. Some things aren't meant to be shared, especially when you can't explain them yourself. The medical team arrived an hour later. They treated me for moderate hypothermia and exhaustion. By morning, I was in a hospital bed in the nearest town, Stanley. The doctor said I was lucky. Another few hours in those conditions, and I would have died. Dale drove up from Park City to bring me home 2 days later. As we passed the turnoff to the Kramer Lake trailhead, I stared out the window at the snow-covered peaks. "You going back up there this summer?" Dale asked, glancing at me. I shook my head. "No," I said quietly. "I don't think so. I've had 3 years to process what happened in the Sawtooth Range. I've read books about Sasquatch sightings, studied earthquake patterns in Idaho, learned about grief behaviors in non-human primates. I've tried to make sense of what I experienced. But some things defy easy explanation. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I know that something in those mountains understood loss and mourning. I know that its footprints led me partway home. I never filed an official report about the creatures, never spoke about them to rangers or researchers. Some secrets belong to the wilderness. Some experiences change you in ways you can't articulate. I still work for parks and recreation, still love the outdoors, but I request assignments in the desert now, open spaces where you can see for miles, places without earthquakes or sudden snowstorms, places where nothing can hide behind the trees, stacking rocks over its dead. Story 9. The headlights of my Subaru cut through the thick Wyoming darkness as I navigated the final stretch of unpaved road. 6 hours of driving from Denver had left me exhausted, but I needed this escape. The divorce papers Laura had served me still sat in my briefcase untouched. 23 years of marriage, dissolved in a legal document I couldn't bring myself to sign. The rental property materialized out of the darkness, a substantial log house, larger than I'd expected from the photos. 2 stories with a wraparound porch and large windows that would showcase the Tetons in daylight. Tonight, those windows were just black squares against the amber logs. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the tick of the cooling motor and the unfamiliar sounds of rural darkness. No city hum, no distant traffic, just wind through pines and the occasional cry of something wild. The property manager had left the porch light on and the key under a flower pot, just as promised. I grabbed my duffel bag and medical journal. Old habits die hard, even when you're on a forced sabbatical from surgery, and trudged up to the door. Inside, the house smelled of pine and something else I couldn't quite place. Not unpleasant, just earthy. I flicked on lights as I moved through the great room with its stone fireplace and leather furniture. The kitchen was well appointed with newer appliances, despite the rustic log construction. Someone had left a basket with coffee, bread, and basic provisions on the counter with a note. "Welcome, Dr. James. Enjoy your stay." I carried my bag upstairs to the master bedroom, which featured a king bed and large picture windows. Those windows bothered me in a way I couldn't articulate. Standing there, I could feel the glass as an insufficient barrier between me and whatever waited in that perfect darkness outside. My hands moved to the heavy curtains before I consciously made the decision to close them. Later, I'd blame exhaustion for the feelings of dread that came over me that first night. I unpacked my toiletries and changed into sweatpants and a t-shirt. But something about the master bedroom felt wrong. The shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The silence felt loaded, like the pause before someone speaks. I grabbed my pillow and a blanket and moved to one of the smaller bedrooms across the hall. This one had twin beds, maybe once a children's room, with simpler windows and plain blue curtains. I pulled those closed too, then settled into the bed farthest from the door. Sleep came eventually, but it wasn't restful. Morning revealed my paranoia for what it was. Just the disorientation of sleeping in a strange place. Sunlight streamed through the windows of the great room, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Through the massive windows, I could see the Tetons rising majestically against a cloudless blue sky. I made coffee and carried it out to the porch, breathing in the pine-scented air. This was exactly what I needed. Space to think, to process what had happened to my marriage, to my career. I finished the coffee and decided to explore the property. The house sat on 10 acres, most of it wild with scattered pines and low scrub. A detached garage stood to the north side, and behind the house I discovered an old root cellar, its wooden doors weathered and sagging. I didn't bother opening it. Nothing I needed down there. By late afternoon, I'd unpacked my things and settled in. I fixed myself a simple dinner and opened a bottle of whiskey I'd brought. As the sun set and darkness fell, I found myself moving through the house, checking windows and doors. That's when I noticed something odd in the master bedroom. The curtains I'd closed the night before were open. I stood in the doorway, staring at those open curtains. Had I dreamed closing them? No. I distinctly remembered pulling them shut, feeling relief as they blocked out the night. Now they hung open, revealing the black rectangle of glass that reflected my confused face back at me. I closed them again, this time making sure the edges overlapped in the middle. Then I went downstairs and poured another whiskey. That night, I chose the twin bedroom again. Around 2 a.m. I jerked awake, disoriented and sweating. A sound had penetrated my sleep, a low, persistent buzzing coming from downstairs. I lay still, listening. It grew louder, then softer, then louder again, like waves of sound. I switched on the bedside lamp and reached for my phone. The screen showed no service, not surprising this far out. The buzzing continued, coming from the great room. I pulled on my slippers and moved to the hallway. The sound was definitely coming from downstairs, a droning, humming sound punctuated by lighter, more erratic buzzing. I flicked on the stairway light and descended slowly. The great room was dark, except for the moonlight filtering through the large windows. I reached for the light switch and froze. The buzzing was louder here, and now I could see movement in the darkness. Hundreds, maybe thousands of small shapes darting through the air. I hit the light switch. The great room flooded with light, revealing what I'd already suspected. Flies, hundreds of fat black flies buzzing through the room, clustering on the windows, crawling on the furniture. I stood, mouth open in shock. Flies are dormant at night. They don't fly in darkness, yet here they were, a writhing cloud of them, fully active at 2 a.m. As soon as the light came on, they began to disperse, flying toward darker corners of the house. Within minutes, they had vanished, though I could still hear faint buzzing from hidden places. I checked the windows and doors, all closed. Where had they come from, and where had they gone? I didn't sleep again that night. At first light, I began searching the house, looking for any sign of the flies or how they might have entered. I found nothing except a guest book in a drawer of the side table. Curious, I opened it. Most entries were typical. Families thanking the owners for a lovely stay, mentioning hikes and trips to Jackson. But a few comments caught my eye. Beautiful house, but what's with all the flies? The Andersons, July 2018. Loved the views and the space. Didn't love the constant buzzing. Maybe check for a nest. Karen and Dave, September 2019. Third time at the Fly House. Still worth it for those sunsets. The Matthews, June 2021. The Fly House, so I wasn't the first to notice. I spent that day outside as much as possible, hiking the property and driving into Alta for groceries. The small general store didn't have much, but the elderly man at the counter was chatty. "Staying up at the old Peterson place, are you?" he asked, as he rang up my items. "The log house off Route 32? Yes, just for a week." He nodded slowly. "Nice views up there. Have you been inside it?" "Can't say I have." Peterson kept to himself mostly. Heard he sold it to some folks from California a few years back. I wanted to ask about flies, about strange noises, but something held me back. I thanked him and left. That night, the weight of my situation finally hit me. Sitting alone in the great room with a glass of whiskey, I pulled out the divorce papers. Laura's signature was there, neat and final. Mine was still missing. The sticky note she'd attached read simply, "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." Tears came then, unexpected and unwelcome. I hadn't cried when she told me she was leaving. I hadn't cried when I moved my things to a hotel. But here, in this strange house, miles from anywhere, the dam broke. I sobbed openly, the sound ugly and raw in the quiet room. And then I heard it. From outside, a sound like an echo, but not quite. A wailing that mimicked my own, but deeper, hollow. I froze, glass halfway to my lips. The sound came again, a mournful howl that rose and fell in pitch, matching the cadence of my sobs from moments before. It wasn't an echo. It was a mimicry. I set down my glass and moved cautiously to the window. The moon was bright enough to illuminate the yard and the tree line beyond. At first I saw nothing. Then a movement caught my eye, something large shifting in the shadows near the edge of the property. I pressed closer to the glass, squinting into the darkness. 2 points of red light blinked into existence, about 8 feet off the ground. Eyes. They were eyes, and they were staring directly at me. I stumbled backward, knocking over the side table. The eyes remained fixed on me, unblinking, hovering impossibly high. Then the wailing sound came again, this time clearly emanating from where those eyes floated in the darkness. Panic seized me. I ran for the front door, fumbling with the lock. Behind me, I heard a scraping sound against the glass. I didn't look back. Outside, the night air hit me like a slap. I sprinted to my car, keys clutched so tightly they bit into my palm. The engine turned over once, twice, failed, then caught on the third try. As I reversed down the driveway, my headlights swept across the front of the house. For a split second, I saw a large, dark shape near the porch, something tall and thin and wrong in proportion. Then it was gone, either moved or hidden by the angle of my departure. I drove straight to the only motel in Alta, a shabby place with 6 rooms and a flickering vacancy sign. The night clerk looked up in surprise as I burst through the door. "Need a room," I gasped, "just for tonight." He slid me a key without questions, probably accustomed to weird behavior from tourists or seasonal workers. In the harsh fluorescent light of the motel bathroom, I stared at my reflection. What had I seen? What had I heard? Was I having some kind of breakdown? The stress of the divorce? The loss of my surgical privileges pending the malpractice review? Was it all catching up to me? Morning brought clarity and embarrassment. I'd overreacted to what was probably just an animal, a bear or moose. The wailing could have been a mountain lion. The eyes, well, many animals' eyes reflect light. I called the property owner, a woman named Carol who lived in Jackson. "Everything okay with the house?" she asked after I introduced myself. "Yes, fine. I thought I saw something last night near the house." "Oh? What kind of something?" "I'm not sure. It was dark. Could have been a bear." She laughed. "Probably was. We get black bears up there sometimes. They're usually more scared of you than you are of them. This one was big, and the eyes were red when my headlights hit them. Sounds like a bear to me. They'll sometimes stand on their hind legs. Makes them look bigger. Don't worry too much about it. Just make sure you don't leave food out." I thanked her and hung up, not convinced, but feeling slightly better. I'd go back, collect my things, and find somewhere else to stay for the remainder of my time in Wyoming. The house looked innocent in daylight, just a beautiful log structure against a mountain backdrop. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, feeling foolish about my midnight flight. Inside, everything was as I'd left it. The overturned side table, the half-empty glass of whiskey, the divorce papers scattered on the floor. I gathered my belongings quickly, not wanting to spend any more time there than necessary. I was about to leave when I realized I'd forgotten my jacket in the twin bedroom. I trudged back upstairs, pushing open the bedroom door. The jacket wasn't on the bed where I thought I'd left it. I checked the closet, pulling open the folding wooden door. The smell hit me first, earthy, damp, with an undertone of rot. The closet floor had been disturbed. A circular section of floorboards had been removed, revealing raw dirt beneath. And in that dirt was a hole, about 2 feet in diameter, descending into darkness. I dropped to my knees, peering cautiously into the hole. It wasn't natural. The sides were too smooth, too cylindrical. It had been dug. As I leaned closer, a fly emerged from the hole, then another and another. A small stream of them began to pour out, buzzing frantically in the closet space. I slammed the closet door shut, heart pounding. As I did, I noticed something caught in the door hinge. Clumps of dark, coarse hair, like animal fur but longer. Some of it was caked with what looked like dried mud or clay. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Something was getting into the house, not through the doors or windows, but from below. Something that used tunnels, that connected to that old root cellar I'd seen, something that brought flies with it. I ran from the house, leaving the jacket behind. As I peeled out of the driveway, I caught a glimpse of the old root cellar doors in my rearview mirror. One of them was partially open, a dark gap visible between the weathered boards. I never went back to the fly house. I signed the divorce papers at a cafe in Jackson and mailed them to Laura's lawyer. I stayed at hotels until my week in Wyoming was up, then returned to Denver to face the wreckage of my life. 3 years have passed. The malpractice suit was settled, my surgical privileges reinstated. Laura and I are cordially distant. I've rebuilt my practice and bought a condo downtown. Sometimes, though, I drive up to Alta. I tell myself it's for the mountain air, the change of scenery. But really, it's to drive past that log house. New owners bought it last year. They've painted the trim and added a swing set in the yard. Sometimes I see children playing there, laughing as they run through sprinklers on hot days. Whatever lived in the fly house seems to be gone now. Or perhaps it's still there, biding its time in those tunnels beneath the floorboards, waiting for the right kind of loneliness, the right kind of despair to draw it out. I don't stop. I don't warn them. I just drive by, windows up, music loud enough to drown out any sounds that might follow me down the highway. Story 10. My hands still shake when I think about that night in the Cascade wilderness. It's been 6 years, but the memory hasn't faded one bit. 7 of us from Evergreen Tech decided to take a weekend backcountry trip into Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest. It was supposed to be a team-building exercise, a chance to disconnect from our screens and reconnect with nature. We were all experienced outdoorsmen. Dale had climbed Mount Rainier 3 times. Brian was an expert fly fisherman who'd spent whole summers in Montana. Jackson had military survival training. Kenny, Will, and Travis had been hiking these mountains since they were kids. Me? I'd grown up in Darrington, just west of the park, and had spent my youth in these woods. The plan was straightforward. Hike 8 miles to Alpine Basin, a remote bowl-shaped valley nestled between 2 ridges at 6,000 feet. We'd camp 2 nights and head back Sunday. The ranger at the station barely glanced at us when issuing our permit, just nodded and handed over the paperwork with a grunt. "Watch your food stores. Bear's been active," he muttered, stamping our form. We hit the trail at 8 a.m. Friday morning. The weather held perfect. Crisp autumn air, blue skies, not too hot for the steady climb. The trail was rough in spots, washed out from spring floods, but we made good time. By late afternoon we reached Alpine Basin. The basin was spectacular, a natural amphitheater rimmed by jagged peaks with a small lake at its center. Huge Douglas firs and western hemlocks crowded the lower slopes. We found a flat area about 50 yards from the lake and set up our tents in a rough circle. Dale insisted we hang our food properly in trees away from camp. "Those bears will smell your candy bar from a mile away," he joked to Kenny, who'd packed an embarrassing amount of snacks. After setting up camp, we cooked freeze-dried meals on our camp stoves, passed around a flask of whiskey, and swapped the usual bullshit about work. The conversation died down early. The hike had worn us out. By 9 p.m., we were all in our tents. I fell asleep instantly to the sound of wind through the treetops. The noise woke me at 3:17 a.m. I know the time because I checked my watch immediately, thinking it was my phone alarm, but it wasn't. What I heard was distant but unmistakable, a sound like an air raid siren, rising and falling in pitch, echoing across the basin. I sat up in my sleeping bag, disoriented. The sound came again, longer this time, echoing off the mountain walls. My tentmate Travis was already awake, sitting upright with wide eyes that reflected the beam of my headlamp. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. "No idea," I said, my mouth dry. We heard rustling from the other tents. The sound came again, closer now, and there was no mistaking it. A mechanical-sounding wail rising and falling in pitch, but with an organic quality that made my skin crawl. It wasn't electronic. It was being produced by something living. "Everyone up?" Dale called from outside. We scrambled out of our tents into the moonlit clearing. The temperature had dropped considerably. Our breath formed clouds in the beam of our headlamps. All 7 of us stood in a tight cluster, listening as the sound came again, closer still. "Mountain lion?" suggested Kenny, his voice higher than usual. Jackson shook his head. "I've heard mountain lions. They scream, yeah, but not like that. That sounds like a goddamn air raid." The noise rang out again and we all flinched. It was definitely closer, maybe half a mile away, and coming from the densely forested slope to our north. "Let's get a fire going," said Brian. He was already gathering kindling from our firewood pile. We built up the fire quickly. The noise continued at irregular intervals, always getting closer. As we worked, we could hear something else between the siren wails, the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the forest. Branches snapped, small trees shook. Whatever it wasn't trying to be stealthy. "We should arm ourselves," Jackson said quietly, his military training kicking in. We looked around at our limited options. Ryan pulled out his Bowie knife, the only real weapon among us. The rest of us grabbed sticks from the firewood pile, selecting the sturdiest pieces. By 3:45 a.m., the fire was blazing, and we stood in a tight circle facing outward. The siren noise was now close enough that we could feel it vibrating in our chests. It had a physical presence, like standing near loudspeakers at a concert. My ears began to ring in the moments of silence between wails. Then it changed. The next sound wasn't a siren at all, but a high-pitched scream, human-like but too powerful, too sustained. It transitioned into a deep, guttural growl that I felt in my bones more than heard with my ears. "Jesus Christ," whispered Will. "What the fuck is that?" I caught movement at the edge of our firelight, something massive shifting between trees, not a bear. Bears don't move like that, don't stand that tall. The screaming started again, so loud it made my head hurt. Then silence, broken only by our ragged breathing. "It's circling us," Dale whispered, turning slowly to track the movement in the darkness. He was right. We could hear it moving around our perimeter, just beyond the firelight. Heavy footsteps, snapping branches, occasional deep, rumbling growls. This continued for what felt like hours. We maintained our position, back to back around the fire, weapons pointed outward. Occasionally, we'd hear a tremendous crack as something large was broken, not branches, but entire saplings and small trees. Then we'd hear a whooshing sound, followed by a crash as these broken trees were hurled into the clearing around us. None hit us directly, but some landed close enough to shower us with dirt and pine needles. At one point, a 6-foot sapling landed just yards from Kenny, roots still attached with dirt clinging to them. Whatever was out there had ripped it clean out of the ground. "It's toying with us," Travis whispered. "It could rush us if it wanted to." Nobody disagreed. By 5 a.m., our firewood was running dangerously low. The creature was still circling, still vocalizing, still throwing things. We'd kept the fire going by burning most of our spare clothes and even one of the smaller tents. But we couldn't keep this up much longer. "We need to see what we're dealing with," Jackson said, adjusting his grip on his makeshift spear. "Next time it makes noise, we all point our headlamps in that direction, together." We nodded grimly, each clicking on our headlamps in preparation. We didn't wait long. The deep, threatening growl started up from the northeast edge of camp. As one, we swung in that direction and switched on our lights. For a split second, just a fraction of a moment, I saw them. A pair of glowing red eyes, reflective like a predator's, but with their own internal illumination. They were at least 8 feet off the ground, maybe higher, spaced wider than a human's. The second our lights hit them, there was a tremendous crash of underbrush, and the eyes vanished. The forest fell completely silent. We maintained our defensive circle, waiting for the next sound, the next thrown object. But nothing came. The absolute silence was almost worse than the screaming. "Did we scare it off?" Kenny asked. "Maybe the light drove it away," Will suggested. We waited another 30 minutes, constantly scanning the darkness, but the creature didn't return. As the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the trees, we could see the devastation around our campsite. Dozens of broken trees and branches littered the clearing. Deep gouges marked the trunks of several large firs, as if something with tremendous strength had dug its claws or hands into the bark. "We need to get out of here," Dale said, voicing what we were all thinking. "Pack only what you need. Leave the rest." Nobody argued. We stuffed our sleeping bags and essential gear into our packs, abandoning cooking equipment, extra clothes, and one damaged tent. We were on the trail by 6:30 a.m., moving at a pace that bordered on reckless, given the rough terrain. No one spoke for the first hour. We just pushed ourselves down the mountain, occasionally looking back over our shoulders. By mid-morning, we'd covered almost 5 miles, putting significant distance between us and Alpine Basin. Only then did we stop to rest and process what had happened. "What the hell was that thing?" Travis asked, gulping water from his bottle. No one answered immediately. Then Kenny looked at me. "Chip, you grew up around here. Any ideas?" I hesitated. Growing up in Darrington, I'd heard all the stories. The locals had names for the things in these mountains, names spoken in hushed tones at bars after too many beers, names most people dismissed as hillbilly superstition. "Sasquatch," I said finally. "Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it." I expected laughter, ridicule, but no one even cracked a smile. "That was no bear," Brian said quietly. "No mountain lion. No animal I've ever encountered." "It stood on 2 legs," Dale added. "Those eyes were way too high off the ground for any normal wildlife." "And the noises," Will said. "Jesus, those noises." We made it back to the trailhead by 2 p.m., moving at a brutal pace, fueled by fear. Our vehicles were the only ones in the parking lot. We threw our gear in the trunks and stood there, unsure what to do next. "Should we report this?" Kenny asked. "To the rangers?" Jackson snorted. "And say what? We heard scary noises and saw glowing eyes?" "We should log it formally," Dale insisted, "for the safety of other hikers." We agreed to stop at the ranger station on our way out of the park. The same ranger who'd issued our permit was on duty. His face remained impassive as Dale recounted a sanitized version of events. Strange noises, something large moving around camp, broken trees. The ranger nodded, jotting notes in a logbook. "Probably black bear," he said without looking up. "They get curious sometimes, especially if campers aren't careful with food." "It wasn't a bear," I said firmly. "Whatever it was stood at least 8 feet tall and made sounds I've never heard before." The ranger's pen paused mid-sentence. He looked up at me, expression carefully neutral. "Like what kind of sounds?" "Like air raid sirens, then screaming, then growling." Something flickered across his face. Recognition, concern. But it disappeared quickly. "I'll make a note of it," he said, returning to his logbook. "Thanks for reporting." That was it. We drove back to Seattle in relative silence, each processing what we'd experienced. Over the following weeks, we met up a few times to talk about that night, but the conversations grew shorter, the details hazier. Some of the guys seemed eager to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a bear with some kind of respiratory issue causing strange vocalizations. Maybe the eyes were just reflection from nocturnal birds. Maybe the thrown trees were just coincidentally falling due to wind. I knew better. 3 years passed. I left Evergreen Tech for another job. Lost touch with most of the guys. But I couldn't shake that night in Alpine Basin. It haunted my dreams. I started researching, diving into local folklore, old newspaper articles, online forums dedicated to Sasquatch sightings in the Pacific Northwest. Last year, I drove back to the ranger station. I needed closure, needed to know if what we experienced was unique or part of a pattern. The old ranger had retired, replaced by a younger woman named Ranger Martinez. When I asked about Alpine Basin, she shook her head. "We don't issue permits for that area anymore," she said. "Hasn't been open to camping for about 4 years now." "Why not?" I asked. She gave the official line about ecological restoration projects, but when I mentioned the date of our trip and described our experience, her professional demeanor cracked slightly. "Look," she said, lowering her voice and checking to make sure we were alone. "I'm not supposed to talk about this, but there have been incidents in that basin going back decades. Your group wasn't the first." She told me off the record that the Park Service had documented at least 7 similar encounters over the past 20 years. There had been 3 unexplained disappearances in that same area. Hikers who went in and never came out, despite extensive search efforts. 2 rangers requested transfers after patrolling that section, she added. One of them, a guy who'd worked here for 18 years with a spotless record, quit the service altogether after spending 1 night up there. Wouldn't even talk about what happened. "Why doesn't the Park Service acknowledge it?" I asked. "Why not close the area officially, or at least warn people?" She gave me a tired smile. "You know why. Can you imagine the official press release? Section closed due to aggressive Bigfoot activity. They'd be laughed out of existence. So instead they reclassify it for ecological restoration and quietly stop issuing permits." I thanked her for her honesty and turned to leave. "One more thing," she called after me. "Whatever your group encountered that night, consider yourselves lucky. You all made it out." I still think about those glowing red eyes, floating 8 feet off the ground in the darkness of Alpine Basin. I think about the inhuman strength required to uproot trees and hurl them at us. And I think about that sound, that terrible siren wail that still echoes in my nightmares. The guys from Evergreen don't talk about it anymore. 2 of them have even tried to convince themselves it was just a bear, a mountain lion, or some kind of mass hallucination. But I know what we experienced was real. And somewhere deep in those mountains, in a basin that's now officially closed for ecological restoration, something waits in the darkness. Something that doesn't want us there. Story 11. I felt it first, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck as I stared down at the sand. The morning had started so normally. My wife Joan had packed our usual picnic of turkey sandwiches and apple slices, while our daughters, Julia and Renee, argued over who would get the front seat for the drive to Ruby Beach. It was our 3rd summer vacationing on the Olympic Peninsula, and the girls had fallen in love with the wild coastline, the massive driftwood, and the sea stacks rising from the water like ancient sentinels. "Cliff, don't forget the tide charts," Joan had called as I loaded the cooler into our Subaru. The charts were essential. Ruby Beach's tide pools were best explored during low tide, and getting caught unaware could be dangerous. We arrived just after 10 a.m. The parking lot was half full, typical for a Tuesday in July. Julia and Renee raced ahead down the path toward the beach, while Joan and I followed at a more measured pace, carrying our supplies. The beach opened up before us, a sprawling expanse of dark sand, dotted with smooth stones and massive driftwood logs, bleached white by salt and sun. Abbey Island stood about 100 yards offshore, accessible by foot during the lowest tides. "Dad, come see the starfish," Renee called, already crouched beside a tide pool. "In a minute, honey," I replied, my attention caught by something unusual in the wet sand near the waterline. I approached slowly, my canvas shoes sinking slightly into the damp surface. What I'd spotted were footprints, human-like impressions leading from the water's edge toward Abbey Island. But these weren't normal footprints. They were massive, easily 18 inches long, and deeply pressed into the sand. The stride length between impressions measured nearly 4 feet. I knelt down, placing my hand beside one print for scale. My entire hand fit comfortably within just the heel portion. "Joan," I called out, but my voice was lost in the wind and the steady crash of waves. I stood, scanning the beach. Most visitors were concentrated around the tide pools or walking along the shoreline. No one else seemed to have noticed the tracks. I followed their path with my eyes, noting how they led directly toward Abbey Island, which was currently accessible due to the low tide. Something compelled me to follow them. I called to Joan, "I'm going to check something out, be right back." She waved absently, helping Julia photograph a purple sea urchin with her phone. I walked alongside the tracks, careful not to disturb them. They proceeded in a straight line toward Abbey Island, occasionally disappearing where water still pooled in deeper depressions of sand, then reappearing on the other side. As I approached the island, The massive driftwood that typically washed up around its base created a natural barrier. The tracks led directly through a narrow opening between two massive logs and continued toward the island's rocky base. The noise of the beach faded as I moved between the tall rocks and driftwood. The tracks led to the north side of the island, away from the main beach area, to a section rarely visited by tourists. Here, I discovered something unexpected. A small alcove at the island's base, partially hidden by overhanging rock and driftwood. The footprints led directly inside. I stopped, suddenly aware of my isolation. The alcove's entrance was dark, and I couldn't see more than a few feet inside. A strong, musky odor emanated from the opening, not the typical scent of seaweed or marine life, but something pungent and animal. A sound came from within, a low, rumbling breath that raised the hair on my arms. I backed away slowly, then turned and hurried back toward my family, no longer caring about the tracks. As I emerged from the driftwood barrier, I glanced back toward the forest edge that bordered the beach's eastern perimeter. That's when I saw it. A large, dark figure standing partially obscured among the trees. Even at this distance, I could tell it was tall, at least 7 or 8 feet, with broad shoulders. It remained motionless, watching the beach, watching us. I reached my family, trying to keep my voice casual. "Hey, let's pack up. I think there's a better spot further down." Joan looked up, surprised. "We just got here, Cliff. The girls are having fun." "I know, but—" I lowered my voice. "I think I saw a bear near the tree line. Best not to stick around." This wasn't entirely a lie. What I'd seen certainly wasn't human. Joan's eyes widened. She immediately called to the girls, who protested until I mentioned the bear. We gathered our things quickly and headed back to the car. As we walked, I kept my body between my family and the forest edge, glancing back periodically. The figure was gone. "Did you really see a bear, Dad?" Julia asked as we reached the parking lot. "I'm not sure what it was," I admitted, "but better safe than sorry." We spent the rest of the day at Calalock Beach, a few miles south. I didn't mention the tracks or the figure to Joan or the girls, telling myself it was probably nothing, maybe a hiker with unusually large feet and a tall person standing in the forest. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. That night in our rental cabin, while Joan showered and the girls watched TV, I searched online for large footprints Olympic Peninsula. The results were immediate and numerous: Bigfoot sightings, research groups, expedition details. I'd always considered such things to be myths, stories told around campfires. But what I'd seen today... I closed the laptop when Joan entered the room. "The girls want to go back to Ruby Beach tomorrow," she said, toweling her hair dry. "They're hoping to see the sea otters that supposedly hang out near Abbey Island." My stomach tightened. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Because of the bear? We could go in the afternoon when more people are around." I hesitated, unwilling to share my real concerns. "All right," I agreed reluctantly, "but we stay with the group. No wandering off." The next day was sunny and clear. We arrived at Ruby Beach around 2 p.m. to find the parking lot full. At least 20 people were scattered across the beach, many with binoculars or cameras with long lenses, focused on the water near Abbey Island. "Look!" Renee pointed excitedly. "Sea otters!" Sure enough, a small group of otters floated lazily in the kelp beds near the island's north side, near the alcove I'd discovered yesterday. We joined the crowd of onlookers, borrowing a pair of binoculars from a friendly elderly couple. I scanned the island's base and the forest edge repeatedly, but saw nothing unusual. The tracks from yesterday had been washed away by the tide. My tension began to ease as we spent an hour watching the playful otters and exploring new tide pools with the girls. Then at 3:17 p.m., I remember checking my watch, gasps rippled through the crowd. Through the borrowed binoculars, I saw what had caught everyone's attention. Something massive and black had emerged from the water near the otters. At first, some people exclaimed, thinking it was a bear swimming, but as it stood upright in the shallow water, reaching for one of the fleeing otters, it became clear this was no bear. It stood at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick black hair that hung in wet mats from its massive frame. Its arms were disproportionately long, ending in large hands with visible fingers. Though distant, its face was clearly not human. A pronounced brow ridge shadowed deep-set eyes, and its jaw jutted forward prominently. The creature missed the otter, which quickly swam out to deeper water. It turned and waded back toward Abbey Island, disappearing into the same alcove I'd found yesterday. Around me, people were excitedly debating what they'd seen. Was that a bear? Did you see how it stood up? Maybe it was someone in a wetsuit. I remained silent, watching the alcove through the binoculars. Joan grabbed my arm. "Cliff, did you see that? What was it?" "I don't know," I lied, my mouth dry. 3 young men in kayaks who had been paddling near the kelp beds began moving toward the island, clearly intending to investigate. I wanted to shout a warning, but couldn't find my voice. The kayakers approached the alcove cautiously. One of them pulled his kayak onto the rocks and proceeded on foot toward the opening. He had only taken a few steps when something happened. I couldn't see what exactly, but the man suddenly scrambled backward, falling into the shallow water. The creature emerged from the alcove, fully visible now to everyone on the beach. It moved with surprising speed, bipedal but hunched forward, its long arms occasionally touching the ground for balance. It pursued the kayakers briefly as they frantically paddled away, then stopped at the water's edge, standing at its full height. Screams erupted from the beach. Parents grabbed children, and people began moving quickly toward the parking lot. Through it all, I stood frozen, watching through the binoculars as the creature surveyed the beach, its gaze seeming to stop on our location. Then it turned and retreated to the alcove. "We need to go," Joan urged, pulling at my arm. She had gathered the girls, who looked confused and frightened. "Wait," I said, my mind racing. "If everyone panics, someone could get hurt." I handed the binoculars back to their owner and raised my voice. "Folks, park ranger volunteer here." This was a complete lie. I was a 6th-grade teacher from Port Angeles, but it had the desired effect. People paused, looking to me for guidance. "What you saw was a black bear. They sometimes swim to the island looking for food. For safety, we should all clear the beach calmly. Please proceed to your vehicles in an orderly fashion." My impromptu announcement worked. The evacuation became more organized, though I heard whispers that contradicted my bear explanation. I ushered my family toward the path, but told Joan I needed to make sure everyone left safely. "I'll be right behind you," I promised. Once they were heading up the path, I turned back to the beach, now nearly empty. Through my own binoculars, I watched the alcove. After several minutes, when the beach was completely deserted, the creature emerged cautiously. It scanned the area, then moved swiftly across the exposed tidal flat, entering the water and swimming with powerful strokes away from the shore, heading north along the coastline. I watched until it disappeared from view, then hurried to join my family. That night I told Joan I thought we should cut our vacation short. I claimed work had called with an emergency, but the truth was I couldn't bear to stay in the area. 3 days later, we were back home in Port Angeles, and I began researching job opportunities outside Washington. By December, I had secured a teaching position in Tucson, Arizona. I told everyone we wanted a change of climate, that the constant rain of the Olympic Peninsula had worn us down. Joan was skeptical but supportive, and the girls eventually adjusted to desert life. Years passed. Julia and Renee grew up, went to college, and eventually moved back to Washington. Julia settled in Seattle with her husband and 2 children, while Renee moved to Olympia. When I retired from teaching in Tucson, Joan wanted to move back to be near our grandchildren. I resisted, but eventually gave in. We bought a small house in Tacoma, close enough to visit our daughters and grandchildren regularly, but far enough from the Olympic Peninsula to ease my mind. Last summer, Julia suggested a family camping trip to Ruby Beach. The kids would love it, Dad. Remember how Renee and I used to search for sand dollars and those sea otters near Abbey Island? I declined firmly, inventing an excuse about my arthritis acting up. When Julia persisted, suggesting we could just go for the day without camping, I was more direct than I intended. "I'm never going back to Ruby Beach," I said, my voice sharper than necessary. "There are plenty of other beaches in Washington." Julia looked hurt, and Joan gave me a puzzled glance. Later, she confronted me. "You've never told me what really happened that day at Ruby Beach, have you?" she asked quietly, as we washed dishes after dinner. I considered continuing the lie I'd maintained for nearly 20 years, but found I didn't have the energy for it anymore. "No," I admitted, "I haven't." "Was it really a bear?" I dried a plate slowly, then set it in the cabinet. "No." Joan waited, but I offered nothing more. Finally, she sighed and touched my arm gently. "Whatever it was, it scared you badly enough to move us across the country. That's all I need to know." I'm 67 now. My grandchildren often ask me to tell them scary stories, and I oblige with tales of haunted houses and friendly ghosts, safe stories with happy endings. What I don't tell them is that monsters are real. One of them lives on the Washington coast, in a tidal alcove near Abbey Island. Sometimes I wake up at night, heart pounding, remembering those massive footprints in the sand and the dark figure watching from the forest edge. I check the locks on our doors and windows before returning to bed. I know what I saw. I know what exists in this world alongside us. And I know that no researcher will ever capture proof. No expedition will ever bring back convincing evidence, because the creature is too intelligent, too cautious. But it's there, waiting in that alcove for unwary kayakers, for curious hikers, for families exploring tide pools. And that's why, despite my grandchildren's pleas and my wife's confusion, I will never set foot on Ruby Beach again. Story 12. I felt it before I saw it. That familiar sensation of being watched while sitting in the lead locomotive rolling through Marshall Canyon. It was mid-January. Snow piled high on both sides of the Burlington Northern Santa Fe tracks between Pasco and Spokane. The moon was nearly full that night, casting an eerie blue glow across the snow-covered landscape. My name's Roy Keller. Been working the rails for BNSF for 11 years. This particular stretch, the Lakeside Subdivision, had become my regular run. Beautiful country, but lonely. Miles of forest, ravines, and not much else. I was at the controls of our westbound grain train, doing about 25 mushers through the canyon. My conductor, Dave Milner, dozed in the second chair. It was 2:17 a.m., according to the dash clock. The heaters were blasting, fighting against the bitter cold outside. That's when the feeling hit me, a prickling at the back of my neck. I've spent enough time in the woods to know when something's out there. Watching. I leaned forward, squinting through the frosty glass. The headlamp cut a bright path ahead, but it was what lurked at the edge of that light that caught my eye. Something big, something black, standing upright on two legs. It was there for just a moment, tall as a bear on its hind legs, but shaped all wrong, too slim, too human-like. Then it slipped into the trees and vanished. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, my hand instinctively reaching for the horn before I stopped myself. Dave needed the sleep, and I wasn't even sure what I'd seen. I chalked it up to exhaustion, to the tricks your mind plays at 2 a.m. when you've been staring at track for hours. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever I'd glimpsed wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, wasn't anything I could name. That was just the beginning. 3 weeks later, Dave and I were making the same run. This time in daylight, a grey February afternoon with light snow falling. We'd just cleared the eastern entrance to Marshall Canyon. "Hear that?" Dave asked suddenly. I throttled back, listening. Above the rumble of our engines came something else, a deep, guttural sound, not quite a howl, not quite a moan. "Probably just the wind," I said, though the air was dead calm. Dave frowned, leaning toward his window. "Nah, that ain't wind." The sound came again. Longer this time, almost like speech, but no words I could make out. Just this deep, resonant vocalization that seemed to bounce off the canyon walls. "There," Dave pointed. On a ridge about 50 yards out, partially hidden by pine trees, stood a figure. Tall, dark, covered in what looked like black fur. It was watching us. Even from that distance, I could tell it was massive, 7, maybe 8 feet tall. Neither of us spoke as we passed by. The figure didn't move, just tracked us with its head as the train rolled westward. After it was out of sight, Dave cleared his throat. You see that, Roy?" "See what?" I replied automatically, some instinct telling me not to acknowledge it. Dave just nodded slowly. "Yeah, me neither." And that was it. We didn't discuss it further. Not that day, not ever. But I saw the way Dave scanned the tree line after that, same as me. The sightings continued through spring and summer, usually just glimpses, a dark shape moving between trees or standing motionless on a distant ridge, sometimes alone, sometimes there seemed to be more than one. They never approached the tracks when we were passing, always keeping their distance, but they were watching, always watching. I started keeping a small notebook recording dates, times, locations. Most sightings were in Marshall Canyon, but occasionally further west toward Ritzville or east toward Spokane. By August, I had logged 17 distinct encounters. One night in late August, I was making the run with a different conductor, Terry Walsh. New guy, transferred from Montana. We were passing through the canyon around midnight when I spotted one. Closer than usual, maybe 30 yards from the tracks, standing perfectly still. "Terry," I said quietly, "look to your right, by that lightning-struck pine." Terry leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. "What am I looking at? A deer?" "Keep watching." The figure moved then, taking several steps parallel to the train before stopping again. "What the hell?" Terry whispered. That's a person. Out here." "Not a person," I said. The creature turned fully toward us then. Even in the darkness, I could make out broad shoulders, long arms, a head that sat directly on those shoulders with no visible neck. It raised one arm, not quite a wave, more like it was acknowledging our presence. Terry pulled back from the window. "Roy, what the fuck is that thing?" I didn't answer. Couldn't answer. The creature lowered its arm and melted back into the forest. Terry was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "I heard stories from guys on the Montana lines about things in the woods. Thought it was just bullshit." "Most guys do," I said. "You've seen them before." It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. "Sasquatch?" Terry asked, his voice barely audible over the engines. "I don't know what they are," I answered honestly, "but they're out there." Terry requested a transfer the following week. He never said why, but I knew. Some people can't handle knowing certain things exist in this world. Dave was back with me by September. If he noticed the creatures more frequently, he never mentioned it. We'd developed an unspoken agreement. We saw what we saw, but we didn't discuss it. The weather turned colder. Leaves changed. Days grew shorter. Our runs through Marshall Canyon increasingly happened in darkness. October 12th. That's a date I'll never forget. We were hauling grain eastbound, climbing the gentle grade through the canyon. It was about 7 p.m., already dark. The train was moving slowly, maybe 15 b.m. on the incline. I spotted them on the high bank to the right of the tracks. Not one creature this time, but 4, Two large ones, one slightly smaller, and one that couldn't have been more than 4 feet tall. A juvenile, I realized with a jolt. They were huddled together, looking down at something on the ground. They hadn't noticed us yet, despite the headlamp and the rumble of the approaching train. "Dave!" I said sharply. "Look right, up on the bank." Dave's head snapped up from his paperwork. He saw them immediately. "Holy shit," he breathed. "Is that a whole family of them?" Before I could answer, the largest creature's head turned our way. It straightened up to its full height, easily 8 feet tall, and made a sharp barking sound. The others looked up then. The smallest one made a high-pitched squeal that cut through the night air. "They're too close to the tracks," I said, reaching for the horn. I blasted 2 long warnings. The effect was immediate and disastrous. Instead of retreating up the bank, the creatures panicked. The largest one leapt down onto the side of the tracks, followed by the others. They were trying to cross in front of us. "No, no, no," I muttered, hitting the horn again and applying the brakes. But a fully loaded grain train doesn't stop on a dime. We were still rolling forward at 12 mph. The smallest creature cleared the tracks first, scrambling up the opposite bank with surprising speed. The medium-sized one followed. The second largest hesitated, looking back at the largest, which was bringing up the rear. It all happened so fast. The second largest made it across just as our engine reached their position. The largest one was halfway across when it stumbled, its foot catching on the rail. The impact was sudden and violent. A heavy thud, followed by a screech of metal as something massive struck the front of our engine. The locomotive shuddered. On the opposite bank, one of the creatures let out a sound I'll never forget. Somewhere between a human scream and a roar. I slammed the emergency brakes. Dave was already on his feet. "Jesus Christ, we hit it!" he shouted. "We fucking hit one of them!" The train lurched and groaned as it slowed. I grabbed the radio to alert dispatch that we'd struck something on the tracks, keeping it deliberately vague. "Possibly a large animal," I said. "Need to check for damage to the locomotive." By the time we ground to a halt, we were nearly a quarter-mile past the impact site. Dave grabbed a flashlight, and we climbed down from the cab. The night was eerily quiet as we walked back along the tracks. No sounds from the forest, no movement, just our flashlight beams bouncing across the gravel and ties. "There should be blood," Dave said as we approached the spot. "Something that big, there should be a lot of blood." He was right, but when we reached the impact site, we found nothing. No blood, no fur, no body. Just a strange, deep depression in the gravel beside the track, as if something heavy had landed there. "It got up," I said in disbelief. "It got hit by a locomotive and it got up and walked away." Dave played his flashlight across the ground. "Look!" He pointed to a series of indentations leading away from the tracks and up the embankment. Footprints, huge ones, sinking deep into the soft earth. They were spaced unevenly, suggesting a limping gait. We followed the prints to the edge of the tree line before stopping. The dark forest beyond seemed to pulse with menace. "We can't go in there," Dave said. "Or whatever that thing is, it's hurt and scared. That's a bad combination." I nodded, feeling sick to my stomach. "Let's get back to the train." As we turned to leave, a sound drifted from the deep woods. That same vocalization I'd heard before, but different now, ragged, pained. It was joined by others, calls and responses echoing through the trees. "They're talking to each other," Dave whispered. I didn't reply. There was nothing to say. The official report listed the incident as a collision with unknown large animal, possibly elk. No remains were found during subsequent daylight inspection. Case closed. But I knew, and Dave knew. On our next 3 runs through Marshall Canyon, I kept a sharp lookout. No sign of the creatures, no sounds, just empty forest and the growing feeling that we were no longer welcome there. On the 4th run, I spotted blood. Dark stains on rocks near the track, At least 100 yards from the impact site. Too much blood for the creature to have survived, I thought. But no body was ever found. 2 weeks after the incident, Dave requested a transfer to the Seattle-Portland line. He didn't tell me he was leaving until his last day. "Can't do this route anymore, Roy," he said as we pulled into Spokane. "Every time we go through that canyon, I'm waiting for them to come for us. For revenge, you know?" I knew exactly what he meant. I'd felt it too. The weight of unseen eyes, heavier now, angrier. "What do you think they are?" I finally asked him, breaking our unspoken rule. Dave was quiet for a long moment. "Don't matter what they are," he finally said. "They were here before us. They'll be here after us. We just need to stay out of their way." A month later, I put in for a transfer myself. Ended up with Union Pacific in Colorado. Different mountains, different forests. No dark shapes watching from the tree line. No deep vocalizations in the night. I never told my wife Mary the real reason we moved. She thinks it was about the promotion, the better pay. Sometimes she catches me staring out the window at the tree line behind our house, and she asks what I'm looking for. "Nothing," I always say. "Just looking." She doesn't believe me, of course. Just like she didn't believe my stories about what happened in Marshall Canyon. Can't blame her. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind blows hard through the Colorado pines, I dream about it. The impact, the sound of its body hitting the locomotive, the cries from the forest, and I wake up wondering if they remember me too, the man who killed one of their own. I wonder if they're still out there watching the trains go by, waiting, remembering. I wonder if the engineers who took my old route feel it too, that prickling sensation at the back of the neck that tells you something's watching, something that doesn't forgive, something that doesn't forget. All I know for certain is this: I'm never going back to Marshall Canyon. Some places, once you've crossed a line, you can never return to. Some bridges, once burned, stay ashes forever. The creatures of Marshall Canyon taught me that lesson. I just hope I'm the only one who had to learn it the hard way. Story 13. I didn't believe in Sasquatch until I saw one eat an entire jug of ketchup. May 23rd, 2015. I'll never forget that date. The weather had finally broken after an unusually cold spring in central Alaska. Blue skies meant perfect flying conditions for my Cessna 185, and I had a scheduled supply run to Walt Pritchard's place deep in the bush. I've been flying these routes for 15 years, delivering to folks who've chosen to live where roads don't reach. Walt was one of my regulars, 4 times a year, like clockwork. I loaded the plane at my small airstrip outside of Talkeetna. Walt's usual order: canned goods, ammunition, coffee, flour, some tools, and always several bottles of Jack Daniels. The man had his priorities. I'd known Walt for about 7 years. Ex-military, maybe late 60s, with a beard that reached his chest and the vocabulary of a drill sergeant. He'd built his cabin and 3 storage sheds himself in a clearing by a small lake, carved a rough landing strip through the trees. It was a nice setup if you liked total isolation. The flight took just under an hour. As I approached Walt's coordinates, I did my usual circle to check the condition of his strip and look for any obstacles. The makeshift runway looked clear, but something immediately caught my eye near the cabin. One of Walt's storage sheds was completely destroyed, wood scattered in a 30-foot radius like matchsticks, not collapsed, demolished. I brought the plane down smoothly despite my unease, the wheels bouncing slightly on the uneven ground before settling. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, scanning the area. No sign of Walt. The silence felt wrong. Usually, he'd be waiting, eager for supplies and whatever news I brought from civilization. I popped the door and climbed out, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. "Walt?" I called out. Nothing. I walked toward the cabin, passing the demolished shed. It wasn't weather damage. This was deliberate destruction. Food containers were scattered everywhere, many torn open. A 50-pound bag of rice had been ripped apart, white grains mixing with the dirt. "Walt!" I shouted louder, my hand instinctively moving toward the .44 Magnum on my hip. I always carried in the bush, usually for bears. Suddenly, the cabin door flew open and Walt burst out, face flushed red beneath his grey beard, eyes wild with panic. He clutched a pistol in each hand, his Colt .45, and what looked like a 9mm Glock. "Thomas, get back to the plane! Sasquatch!" He screamed, waving the guns in a way that made me more nervous about getting shot by Walt than whatever he thought he'd seen. "Whoa, Walt, calm down," I started, but the words died in my throat as my eyes followed where he was frantically pointing. About 30 yards away, standing beside the ruined shed, was something impossible, something that shouldn't exist outside of documentaries and campfire stories. It stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark brown hair that hung in matted clumps from its massive frame. The proportions were all wrong for a bear. Too upright, shoulders too broad, arms too long. Its legs were thick as tree trunks, firmly planted in a stance that was unmistakably human-like. But its face, that's what froze my blood. A flat, wide nose above a mouth that hung partially open, exposing yellowed teeth and what looked like a black tongue. The eyes were deep-set under a prominent brow ridge, intelligent and calculating. What I first took for blood covering its mouth and chest was actually bright red ketchup. At its feet lay a plastic commercial-sized ketchup jug, completely empty. "Told you!" Walt screamed. "Been terrorizing me for 3 days! Destroyed everything!" The creature's head snapped toward us at Walt's shouting, and I swear I saw recognition in those eyes. Not animal awareness, but something closer to human comprehension. Walt raised both pistols and started firing wildly. The shots cracked through the air, but his hands were shaking so badly I could see he was missing by yards. The effect on the Sasquatch was immediate and terrifying. Its face contorted with rage, lips pulling back to expose more of those yellow teeth. It let out a roar that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard, deeper than a bear, more articulated than a moose, almost like distorted human anger. Then it charged. I've seen grizzlies run. This was different. Despite its bulk, the creature moved with shocking speed, covering ground in loping strides that ate up the distance between us in seconds. "Run!" I grabbed Walt's arm and yanked him toward the plane. He kept firing behind us, the shots getting more desperate. 20 yards from us, the Sasquatch paused by Walt's generator, a heavy-duty model that must have weighed over 200 pounds. With one hand, one goddamn hand, it grabbed the machine and flung it sideways like it was made of styrofoam. The generator crashed through the wall of Walt's remaining shed. That's when I knew we were dealing with strength beyond anything human. We reached the plane, and I shoved Walt inside, scrambling into the pilot's seat. My hands shook as I started the ignition sequence, praying the engine would catch quickly. Through the windshield, I could see the creature approaching, its stride now almost casual, as if it knew we couldn't escape in time. The engine sputtered, caught, then roared to life. I taxied faster than was safe, bouncing violently on the uneven ground. In my side mirror, I saw the Sasquatch reach the spot where we'd been standing just moments before. It stopped and watched us, making no attempt to chase the accelerating plane. I pulled back on the yoke, and we lifted off, clearing the trees at the end of the runway by mere feet. As we gained altitude, I looked down. The creature stood in the middle of the runway, looking up at us. Then it did something I still see in my nightmares. It raised its massive arm and shook a fist at the plane. Its mouth twisted in what I could only describe as a smug, knowing expression. This wasn't just an animal. Whatever this thing was, it understood exactly what it was doing. Walt was hyperventilating beside me, still clutching his empty pistols. "How long has that thing been there?" I asked when I found my voice. 3 days, Walt gasped, finally lowering his guns. Started with small stuff, breaking into the food shed, stealing supplies. I fired warning shots the first day. Big mistake, got angry. Each day it's destroyed more. Playing with me, Thomas. It's goddamn playing with me. I circled once more over the property before heading back to Talkeetna. From above, I could see the full extent of the damage. One shed completely destroyed, another partially damaged. The generator lay where it had been thrown, and countless supplies were scattered across the clearing. The Sasquatch had disappeared into the tree line. "Walt, we need to report this," I said. "To who? Fish and Wildlife? They'll think I'm crazy. You think I'm crazy?" He looked at me with desperate eyes. I shook my head slowly. "No, I saw it too." We flew back in silence. When we landed in Talkeetna, Walt refused to file any reports. He just asked to stay in town for a few days before heading back. I didn't argue. I wouldn't have gone back either, but Walt was stubborn. His whole life was in that cabin. A week later, after much debate, I agreed to fly Walt back to assess the damage and retrieve what he could. He brought more ammunition this time, and a rifle. We approached cautiously, circling the property several times before landing. From the air, my stomach dropped. The destruction was total. Walt's cabin was reduced to a pile of splintered logs and broken furniture. All 3 storage sheds were flattened. A decade of Walt's life had been systematically destroyed in what appeared to be hours of calculated rage. I landed anyway, against my better judgment. Walt was silent as we surveyed the devastation up close. His rifles, tools, books, photos, everything strewn across the clearing and surrounding woods. Most disturbing were the deliberate arrangements. His broken chair placed upright in the middle of where his cabin had stood. Canned goods stacked in neat pyramids. His clothes hung from tree branches like bizarre decorations. "It's sending a message," Walt mumbled, kicking at the remains of his wood stove. "This is its territory now." We spent 3 hours collecting what little could be salvaged. Walt never explained what might have provoked the creature initially, and I didn't press him. Something in his eyes told me he knew more than he was saying. That was the last time I saw Walt Pritchard. He disappeared after we returned to Talkeetna, leaving behind the few possessions we'd recovered. The motel owner said he'd paid for 2 nights, but checked out after 1. No forwarding address, no goodbye. Just gone. 4 months later, in late September, curiosity got the better of me. I flew back over Walt's property. The landing strip was already overgrown, making landing impossible. From the air, I could see nature reclaiming the clearing. Something dark moved at the edge of the trees. It could have been a moose or a bear, but the way it stood, upright, watching, made the hair on my neck stand up. I banked away and didn't circle back. Some territories once claimed are best left alone. The following spring, I got a call from a man looking to build a cabin in that same general area. He'd heard it was good fishing. I made up a story about unstable ground and dangerous wildlife. He found somewhere else. Sometimes, when I'm flying over that section of wilderness, I cut my engine just a bit, flying as quietly as possible, and I look down at Walt's old clearing. I've never seen the Sasquatch clearly again, but twice I've spotted something large moving unnaturally through the trees. Last month, I flew a wildlife biologist to a research station 50 miles from Walt's old place. As we passed over the general area, she pointed out an unusual pattern of game movement. "Strange," she said, studying her maps. "There's a dead zone here. Perfectly good habitat, but no large animals. Bears, moose, wolves, they're all avoiding this specific radius. Almost like they know something we don't." I just nodded and adjusted our course. I still fly over central Alaska almost daily, bringing supplies to people who've chosen to live beyond roads. I've seen bears destroy camps and moose charge unwary hikers. I've witnessed wolverines tear apart locked coolers and wolves strategically hunt in packs, but nothing has ever made me question my understanding of the natural world like that day at Walt's cabin. Sometimes in the endless summer twilight, flying low over the vast wilderness, I scan the tree line, part of me hoping to catch another glimpse, another part praying I never do. The Alaskan bush has rules. Respect the land, be prepared, know your limits. And now I've added one more. Some territories are marked in ways we weren't meant to understand. Story 14. A clammy sweat soaked through my shirt as I stared at the enormous creature blocking my path. It looked back at me with eyes that reflected far more intelligence than any animal I'd ever seen. My legs wobbled beneath me. My heart hammered so hard against my ribs, I thought they might crack. The creature and I were locked in a frozen moment of mutual shock, neither of us moving a muscle. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. My name's Rebecca Miller. 3 months ago, my husband David decided our 15-year marriage wasn't worth the hassle anymore. He left me for Jenny, a 20-something waitress from Buck's Sports Bar with bleached blonde hair, and the kind of figure I stopped having after our second kid. The divorce papers arrived 2 weeks later. The custody battle for our children became a nightmare. David's family had deep roots in Humboldt County, and his lawyer painted me as unstable and unfit. I was drowning in legal fees and emotional exhaustion when I found my escape, bird watching. It started by accident. One morning in late August, I sat on the back porch of my rented single-wide, nursing a cup of coffee and feeling sorry for myself. A flash of red caught my eye. A northern cardinal perched on my bird feeder. Something about its brilliant color against the dreary landscape captured me. I grabbed my phone and took a picture. The next day, I bought a basic pair of binoculars at the hardware store in town. By the end of the week, I downloaded 3 bird identification apps and ordered a field guide. 2 weeks later, I was spending every free moment hiking the forests around Everett Ridge, a wooded valley about 15 miles from my rental. That Sunday in September started like any other. I packed a small backpack with water, trail mix, my binoculars, and a notebook. The morning air had a crisp bite to it as I parked my 2008 Honda Civic at the trailhead lot. Only 2 other cars were there, a beat-up pickup and a Subaru with a Keep Tahoe blue sticker. Perfect. I craved solitude. The trail wound through stands of Douglas firs, cedars, and redwoods, so massive they belonged in another era. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in dusty shafts, spotlighting patches of moss-covered ground. The earthy smell of decomposing leaves and damp soil filled my lungs. For the first time in months, my shoulders relaxed. I spotted a Steller's jay, its blue feathers electric against the forest greens. Then, a red-breasted nuthatch working its way down a tree trunk. I jotted each sighting in my notebook, noting the time and location. The hours slipped by as I wandered deeper into the forest, following bird calls and movement in the branches above. At some point, I veered off the main trail onto a deer path that followed a small creek. The water bubbled over smooth stones, providing background music to my adventure. I saw a spotted towhee scratching in the underbrush and froze, watching it through my binoculars for nearly 20 minutes. By the time I checked my phone, it was 5:47 p.m. Shit, I muttered. Sunset was around 7:30 this time of year, but these woods got dark fast under the dense canopy. I needed to get back to my car. I shoved my notebook into my pack and started retracing my steps, moving quickly. The temperature had dropped, and I pulled my fleece tighter around me. My breath came out in small clouds as I pushed through fern patches and ducked under low branches. That's when I noticed the silence. It hit me suddenly, the complete absence of sound. No squirrels chittering, no birds calling. Even the insects had gone quiet. The forest that had been alive with noise all day now felt like a vacuum. The hair on my arms stood up. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder. Nothing looked different, but something felt wrong. That primal part of my brain, the part that knows when you're being hunted, screamed at me to run. I rounded a bend in the trail and stopped dead in my tracks. About 30 feet ahead stood a massive creature, partially hidden behind a large redwood. I blinked hard, certain my eyes were playing tricks, but when I opened them, it was still there. The thing was enormous, at least 8 feet tall. Dark brown fur covered its body, thicker around the shoulders and tapering at the waist. Its arms hung longer than any human should, with large hands half-curled at its sides. The face was flatter than a gorilla's, but not human either, a broad nose and deep-set eyes under a prominent brow ridge. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever name you wanted to use, I was looking at it. And it was looking right back at me. My mouth went dry. I couldn't move, I couldn't even breathe. We stared at each other across the distance, neither making a sound. Its eyes held mine, dark and intelligent, filled with what seemed like curiosity rather than aggression. I don't know how long we stood there. Time stretched and compressed in that moment. My mind raced through options. Play dead? Make noise? Back away slowly? Every instinct screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Then I shifted my weight, and my boot came down on a fallen branch. The crack echoed through the silent forest like a gunshot. The spell broke. The creature's head jerked at the sound. It gave me one last look, then turned away, moving with surprising grace for something so large. It disappeared into the dense underbrush without making a sound, there one moment, gone the next. I stood frozen for 10 more seconds before my survival instinct kicked in. Then I ran. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, tripping over roots and slapping branches away from my face. My lungs burned and my legs screamed, but fear pushed me forward. When I finally reached the parking lot, only my car remained. I fumbled with my keys, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the door. Once inside, I locked all the doors and started the engine. The clock on the dashboard read 6:22 p.m. I peeled out of the lot, gravel spraying behind my tires. The road twisted down the mountain, and I took each curve too fast, fighting to keep control. My hands shook so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. By the time I reached my rental house, night had fallen. I sat in my driveway with the engine running for 5 full minutes, scanning the tree line at the edge of the property. Eventually, I sprinted from the car to the front door, slammed it behind me, and threw all 3 locks. I spent that night on the couch with all the lights on, jumping at every sound. My mind replayed the encounter on an endless loop. The size of it, the intelligence in its eyes, the way it moved so silently through the forest. I couldn't make sense of what I'd seen. When morning came, I called in sick to the dental office where I worked as a receptionist. I sat at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, and tried to decide what to do. Tell someone? Who would believe me? In the harsh light of day, I almost didn't believe it myself. Call the police, and say what exactly? I saw Bigfoot? They'd think I was crazy or drunk. The last thing I needed was more ammunition for David's lawyer to use against me in the custody battle. So I did the next best thing. I turned to the internet. I started with basic searches. Bigfoot sightings, Northern California. Sasquatch, Humboldt County. What to do if you see a Bigfoot. The results were a mix of tourist trap websites, conspiracy theories, and first-hand accounts. I clicked on a forum called Sasquatch Encounters and started reading. The first post I opened stopped me cold. A logger named Keith from Oregon described an encounter almost identical to mine. The unnatural silence, the creature partially hidden behind a tree, the mutual observation, the way it disappeared without a sound when startled. The details matched my experience so precisely that I felt a chill run down my spine. I kept reading. Post after post described similar experiences, the silence before the sighting, the creature's cautious curiosity, the lack of aggression. People from Washington, Oregon, Northern California, British Columbia, all telling variations of the same story. By mid-afternoon, I'd moved from forums to YouTube videos. I watched interviews with witnesses, footage of supposed Bigfoot sightings, and documentaries about the Pacific Northwest's most famous cryptid. Some were clearly hoaxes, men in gorilla suits stumbling through forests, but others felt authentic, especially when the witnesses described their emotional reactions. The same mix of terror and awe I'd felt. The next day, I went to the library and checked out every book they had on Sasquatch. The librarian raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment. I spent the weekend highlighting passages and making notes, comparing details with my own experience. One book in particular caught my attention: Forest Giants, The Cultural History of Sasquatch, by an anthropologist from UC Berkeley. He approached the phenomenon not as a question of whether Bigfoot existed, but as an examination of the consistent patterns in sighting reports across cultures and time periods. The book included indigenous stories that predated European settlement, all describing similar creatures. A week after my encounter, I worked up the courage to go back to Everett Ridge. Not on the same trail, I wasn't that brave, but to a more frequented path with regular hikers. I brought a disposable camera this time, just in case. Every snapping twig made me jump, and I kept scanning the trees around me. I didn't see the creature again that day or during my next 5 visits. But something had changed in my relationship with the forest. I noticed details I'd overlooked before. Unusual branch breaks high in the trees, strange arrangements of rocks, areas where the underbrush had been compressed by something heavy. 2 weeks after the sighting, I found an online group that met monthly at a coffee shop in Eureka to discuss Sasquatch experiences. I sat in my car outside Moonrise Coffee for 20 minutes, debating whether to go in. What if they were all nuts? What if I was becoming one of them? Finally, I went inside. 6 people sat around a table in the back, 3 men and 3 women, ranging from their 20s to their 70s. They looked surprisingly normal. No tinfoil hats, no wild eyes, just regular people sipping coffee and eating muffins. I approached hesitantly, and a woman about my age with short grey hair noticed me hovering. "First time?" she asked with a kind smile. Her name tag read Martha. I nodded. "Welcome," she said, pulling out a chair beside her. "We don't bite, though we might talk your ear off about things most people would laugh at." I sat down and introduced myself. They didn't press me to share immediately, instead discussing a recent possible track finding near Trinidad. Their conversation was measured and skeptical. They debated whether the tracks were authentic, considered alternative explanations, and talked about proper documentation methods. An hour into the meeting, Martha turned to me. "So, Rebecca, what brings you here?" All eyes turned to me. I took a deep breath and told them everything. The silence in the forest, the creature behind the tree, the staring contest, the way it disappeared. I described the intelligence in its eyes and the fear I felt afterward. When I finished, no one laughed. No one exchanged knowing looks. They nodded and asked clarifying questions. They treated my experience as valid and real. "Classic observation encounter," said Jim, a retired forest ranger. "They're curious about us, but cautious. You're lucky. Most people only get glimpses." "The silence is the giveaway," added Denise, a wildlife biologist. "They communicate with other animals somehow. When they want privacy, everything goes quiet." Martha patted my hand. "The first encounter is always the most shocking, but now you're part of the club." "What club?" I asked. "The people who know," she said simply. "Most folks go through their whole lives never seeing what you saw. They think we're crazy or attention-seeking, but you know different now." After the meeting, we exchanged phone numbers. For the first time since David left, I felt connected to something larger than my pain. These people understood an experience that had profoundly changed me, an experience most would dismiss as delusion or lies. I started attending the meetings regularly. Between them, I continued my research and forest visits. I learned to look for signs, stick structures, tree breaks, impressions in moss. I never saw the creature again that fall, but twice I heard wood knocks echoing through the trees. Thunk, 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 the supposed communication method of Sasquatch. In November, the judge awarded David primary custody of our children, with me getting weekends and Wednesday evenings. It hurt, but not as much as I expected. I'd found something that was just mine, a secret world, a community, a purpose. My rental house walls gradually filled with maps marked with sighting locations, photos of footprint casts, and printouts of articles. I bought a better camera and a voice recorder. I started a journal documenting my forest experiences. When my kids visited, they noticed the change in me. "Mom seems happier," I overheard my daughter tell her brother one Saturday. "She doesn't cry in the bathroom anymore." She was right. The divorce still stung, but it didn't define me anymore. Something extraordinary had happened to me in those woods, something that connected me to a mystery larger than my broken marriage. I'd glimpsed a world beyond shopping malls and custody schedules and alimony payments, a world where ancient creatures still moved through old-growth forests, largely unseen by human eyes. I don't know if I'll ever see the Sasquatch again. But in a strange way, that single encounter gave me back something I thought David had taken forever, a sense of wonder about the world and my place in it. After feeling so alone during the divorce, knowing others had shared my extraordinary experience gave me an unexpected connection, both to them and to something wild and mysterious that still roams our forgotten places. Every weekend now I pack my backpack with supplies, grab my binoculars, and head for the forests. I tell people I'm going bird watching, and I do watch birds. But I'm looking for something else too, something that most people will never see, but that I know is out there, moving silently between the monster redwoods, watching and waiting. Story 15. I stared at the shotgun in my gun safe for a longer time than usual that morning. Something about the air felt wrong as I stepped outside my cabin at 5:18 a.m. The humidity already hung like a wet blanket, though the sun hadn't yet crested the cypress trees. My uniform stuck to my back by the time I reached my Forest Service truck parked under the carport. 29 years of ranger service in the Ocala Wildlife Management Area had taught me to trust my instincts. Today, those instincts whispered trouble. I'm Jedediah Thompson. Most folks just call me Jed. In 3 months and 16 days, I'd be turning in my badge, hanging up my hat and fishing full-time instead of between shifts. The Florida Wildlife Commission had already started interviewing my replacement. The truck's engine turned over with a familiar rumble. I adjusted the rearview mirror, noticing new wrinkles around my eyes that seemed to have appeared overnight. 58 years old, and the swamp had carved its history into my face. "Gonna be a scorcher," I muttered to nobody, checking the dashboard thermometer, already reading 82 degrees at this ungodly hour. I had a routine morning inspection planned for the western access roads. Hurricane season was approaching, and we needed clear evacuation routes if a big one hit. The western section was the least visited part of our reserve, a tangled mess of saw palmetto, water oak, and cypress swamp that tourists never bothered with. Perfect habitat for our resident black bears, the occasional panther, and more alligators than you could count. The truck bounced down the Shell Rock Road leading away from the ranger station. I passed Bobby Whitaker heading in for the day shift, raised 2 fingers off the steering wheel in greeting, and turned onto County Road 314. After 3 miles, I pulled onto the unmarked access road that ran along the western boundary. No other vehicles had been down this path in days, judging by the unmarked dirt. Spanish moss hung from the live oaks, creating a tunnel effect over the narrow dirt track. Both sides dropped off into black water that concealed all manner of creatures beneath its tannin-stained surface. I rolled down the windows, letting in the morning chorus of frogs and cicadas. Johnny Cash's Man in Black played softly on the truck's radio. I wear the black for the poor and the beaten down. Johnny's voice crackled through the aging speakers as I scanned the tree line. An alligator sunned itself on a mud bank to my right. 12-footer at least. I'd named him Old Pete years back, though I couldn't tell you why I was certain it was the same one each time. The big bull gators stake out territory and don't much care to leave it. The road narrowed as it curved deeper into the swamp. Here, the tree canopy grew so thick that permanent shadows cloaked the ground. I slowed to a crawl over a particularly rough patch, the truck bouncing through potholes filled with murky water. That's when I noticed the silence. The frogs had stopped. The birds went quiet. Even the insects ceased their constant buzzing. In nearly 3 decades of working these swamps, I'd learned that sudden silence meant one thing. Something had disturbed the natural order. I tapped the brakes, slowing to about 5 miles per hour. My right hand moved to the center console, where my service pistol sat in its holster. Not that I'd ever needed it for more than putting down the occasional injured animal, but today, that weird feeling crawled up my spine again. Movement flickered in my peripheral vision. Something large shifted in the dense tangle of vegetation about 30 yards ahead on the left side of the road. I squinted, trying to make it out through the dappled shadows. A black bear, maybe? We had plenty of those, though they generally avoided the roads during daylight hours. I eased off the gas, letting the truck coast forward at barely more than an idle. The radio signal faded to static, and I reached over to turn it off. My window remained down, letting in the heavy, still air that smelled of decay and stagnant water. The cracking sound of branches snapping echoed across the swamp. Whatever moved through the brush was heavy and didn't care about stealth. I reached for my binoculars on the passenger seat, but before I could bring them to my eyes, the tree line erupted. A massive figure burst from the dense foliage. My brain struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. The creature ran upright on 2 legs, charging directly toward my truck with surprising speed. It stood about 6 feet tall, completely covered in shaggy auburn-colored hair. My first confused thought was bear, but no, the proportions were all wrong. Though it had a simian appearance, somewhat like a chimpanzee, its body structure seemed more human, with longer, muscular legs. Its arms swung wildly as it ran, hands extending down to its knees or even further. "What the hell?" I breathed, my foot frozen between the gas and brake pedals. The creature covered the distance between the tree line and my truck in seconds. I had just enough time to grip the steering wheel with both hands before it slammed into the steel crash bar mounted on the front of my Forest Service vehicle. The impact sent a violent jolt through the entire chassis, rocking the truck backward. Before I could react, a long, hairy arm shot through my open window. Fingers, distinctly human-like but hairless, grabbed at my uniform shirt. The thick black nails at the end of those fingers looked like curved daggers, capable of shredding flesh with minimal effort. A stench flooded the cab of my truck so powerful it triggered my gag reflex instantly. The closest comparison I could make was a skunk spray mixed with rotting meat and something musky and primordial. My eyes watered as I choked on the putrid odor. The creature's face pressed against the window frame, eyes, deeply set and amber-colored, locked onto mine with unmistakable intelligence. Its flat, broad nose flared as it sniffed the air. Lips pulled back, revealing yellowish teeth with prominent canines. A sound rumbled from its chest, not quite a growl, deeper and more complex. The noise raised every hair on my body, triggering some ancient part of my brain that recognized predator. Those fingers tightened on my shirt, pulling me toward the window. I felt the truck shift as the creature's weight pressed against the door panel. Its matted fur brushed against my arm, coarse and wiry. Survival instinct kicked in. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal. The engine roared, and the truck lurched forward violently. The sudden movement caught the creature off balance. Its grip loosened as it fell sideways. Those terrible nails scraped against the door panel with a sound like metal dragging across a chalkboard. The creature scrambled to maintain its hold, but the momentum of the accelerating truck pulled me from its grasp. I kept my foot pressed firmly on the gas, the truck bouncing wildly over the uneven road. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My heart hammered in my chest as I gasped for breath in the stench-filled air. The rearview mirror showed the creature regaining its balance in the middle of the dirt road. It shook its head, almost like a human gesture of frustration. Then it turned and loped back toward the brush line, disappearing into the dense vegetation with surprising speed and agility for something its size. I didn't slow down for 2 miles, only easing off the gas when I reached the paved service road that would take me back to headquarters. My hands trembled as I rolled up the window. The stench clung to my uniform and the truck's interior so powerful I could taste it. My mind raced, trying to catalogue what I'd just seen against every animal I knew lived in these swamps. Nothing matched. 30 years of experience with Florida wildlife, and I had absolutely no explanation for what had just attacked my vehicle. Back at headquarters, I pulled into my reserved parking spot and cut the engine. For a long time I just sat there trying to decide what to do next. Protocol said I should report any unusual wildlife encounters, especially aggressive ones. But what would I say? That I'd seen some kind of hairy ape-man in a swamp where no such creature was known to exist? I examined the side of my truck. 4 distinct scratches ran along the door panel, cutting through the green paint to the metal beneath. The front crash bar was dented where the creature had collided with it. Bobby Whitaker walked past, coffee mug in hand, and nodded toward the damage. "What'd you hit, Jed? Another gator?" "Yeah," I lied. "Big one on the west access road came right out in front of me." Bobby nodded, seemingly satisfied with my explanation, and continued into the building. I entered the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My uniform shirt had a tear on the left side where those fingers had grabbed me. When I pulled the fabric aside, I could see 3 red marks on my skin where the nails had pressed, not quite breaking the skin but leaving clear impressions. The smell still clung to me, though less intensely now. I scrubbed my hands and face with soap, changed into the spare uniform I kept in my locker, and threw the stained one in a plastic bag. Back at my desk, I opened my incident report form on the computer. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. What exactly was I supposed to write? I'd worked my entire adult life in wildlife management. I had a degree in forestry from the University of Florida. I knew every native species in the state, their habits, their territories. Nothing in my education or experience could explain what I'd encountered. I closed the form without typing a word. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those amber eyes staring at me, felt those fingers gripping my shirt. I got up and pulled a dusty folklore book from my shelf, one I'd bought years ago at a gift shop. I'd laughed at it then. A collection of Florida's weirdest legends and cryptid sightings. I wasn't laughing now, as I flipped through the pages until I found what I was looking for, the Florida skunk ape. The description matched what I'd seen with eerie accuracy. Bipedal, around 6 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown hair. Known for its terrible smell, like a combination of skunk spray, garbage and swamp gas. Most sightings occurred in the Everglades, but there were reports from all over Florida's wetland areas. I closed the book and poured myself a finger of bourbon. I'd always dismissed these stories as nonsense, the product of overactive imaginations or misidentified bears. Now, I wasn't so sure. The next day, I returned to the Western Access Road. I parked near where the encounter had happened and walked the area with my rifle slung over my shoulder. The ground was too hard and dry to show footprints, but I found broken branches where the creature had emerged from the tree line. Some of the breaks were 8 feet off the ground, higher than any bear could reach. In the weeks that followed, I said nothing about what I'd seen. I went about my duties, but I never went down that access road without my shotgun within reach and my windows rolled up tight. I started researching skunk ape sightings in my off hours, creating a file of reports from across the state. 2 months passed. My retirement date approached. The commission hired my replacement, a young woman named Sarah Jenkins, fresh out of college, with a degree in environmental science. I spent my final weeks showing her the ropes, taking her to all the areas she'd need to patrol, all except the Western Access Road. I made excuses every time it came up on the schedule. My last day came. The Rangers threw me a small party at headquarters with a cake shaped like my truck. We drank non-alcoholic punch, told old stories, and they presented me with a fishing rod as a retirement gift. Through it all, I smiled and thanked them, but my mind kept returning to what waited in the swamp. After everyone left, I sat alone in my office, Sarah's office now, staring at the map of the management area on the wall. The western section seemed to stare back at me, hiding its secrets. A knock on the door frame pulled me from my thoughts. Mike Jameson, one of the few rangers who'd been around almost as long as me, leaned against the doorway. "Penny for your thoughts, old-timer," he said. "Just taking it all in one last time," I replied, gesturing around the cramped office. Mike nodded and closed the door behind him. He pulled up a chair and sat opposite me, his expression serious. "Jed, we've known each other what? 20 years? 23, I corrected. "Right, so I think I know when something's eating at you. You've been jumpy as a swamp rabbit these last couple months. What happened out there?" I looked at him for a long moment, weighing my options. Mike was solid, not given to wild stories or flights of fancy. If there was anyone I could tell, it was him. "You believe in the skunk ape, Mike?" I asked. His face remained neutral, giving nothing away. "I believe there's plenty in these swamps we don't fully understand. Why do you ask?" So I told him everything. The creature bursting from the trees, the attack on my truck, those human-like hands with their terrible nails, the eyes that held intelligence, and that ungodly smell that took days to fade from my vehicle. When I finished, Mike didn't laugh or look at me like I'd lost my mind. He just nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to the map on the wall. "Western Access Road, you said?" I nodded. Mike took a deep breath. "Back in '97, I was doing night patrols during a drought. We had problems with poachers coming in after dark to hunt on the dried-up lake beds." He paused, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I was parked down on that same stretch, lights off, watching for spotlights. Something big moved through the trees about 50 yards away. I put my spotlight on it just for a second." He met my eyes. "What I saw matches your description exactly. 6 feet tall, walking on 2 legs, covered in reddish hair. It looked right at me, eyes reflecting in my spotlight. Then it was gone. The smell hit me a few seconds later, so bad I had to leave my post." "You never reported it," I said. "It wasn't a question. Same reason you didn't. Who'd believe it? I figured I'd misidentified a bear, or maybe the heat and isolation were getting to me. Convinced myself it was nothing." He shrugged. "But I never went down that road alone at night again." Relief washed over me. I wasn't crazy. Someone else had seen it too, in the same area. "What do you think it is?" I asked. "Don't know. Some kind of primate that's adapted to the swamps? Maybe something that escaped from a private zoo decades ago and established a breeding population? Or maybe it's something that's always been here, staying hidden except when it wants to be seen." We sat in silence for a while, 2 old rangers contemplating mysteries on the edge of retirement. "You gonna tell Sarah?" Mike finally asked. I thought about the young ranger, eager and by the book. "No," I decided. "She'll either think I'm senile or she'll go looking for it. Neither ends well." Mike nodded in agreement. "Some things in these swamps are better left alone." I gathered my few personal items and took one last look around the office. 29 years of service, and I was leaving with a mystery I could never solve or share. As Mike and I walked to the parking lot, the setting sun cast long shadows across the headquarters building. You know, Mike said as we reached our vehicles, they say these creatures are most active at dusk and dawn, crepuscular, like a lot of predators. I glanced toward the western edge of the reserve, where the sun was sinking into the cypress trees. Out there, something watched and waited. Something that knew these swamps better than any ranger ever could. You take care fishing those back lakes, Jed, Mike said, extending his hand. Some things out there don't appear on any wildlife management plan. We shook hands, and I climbed into my personal truck, no Forest Service logo or crash bar. As I drove away from headquarters for the last time, I kept my windows rolled up tight, even in the summer heat. The skunk ape was real. I'd seen it with my own eyes, felt its strength, smelled its presence, and now, as a private citizen rather than a ranger, I could finally admit a truth I'd been avoiding. For all our maps and management plans, for all our scientific certainty about what lived in these swamps, we didn't know everything. The wilderness still held secrets, and some of those secrets had amber eyes and fingers that could tear a man apart.